For thousands of years, humans have described mysterious beings of light descending from the heavens. They were called gods, angels, messengers, and divine beings. But what if some of these stories were actually encounters with something far more mysterious? In ancient alien lore, they're known as the Shining Ones, powerful beings who may have been mistaken for supernatural entities by ancient civilizations. Could these legends preserve memories of extraterrestrial visitors? Or are the Shining Ones simply symbolic figures created by ancient religions? In this video, we explore the mysterious connection between ancient gods, angels, and the alleged beings of light who may have inspired some of humanity's oldest myths. Every civilization that has ever carved a symbol into stone or pressed a reed into wet clay has left behind the same strange inheritance. Stories of beings who came from the sky, who shone with an unnatural light, who possessed knowledge far beyond the people who recorded their visits and who were, in nearly every case, mistaken for gods. In Sumer, they were called the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. In Egypt, they were the Neteru, the divine ones who ruled during Zep Tepi, the first time, before history as we know it began. In the Hebrew scriptures, they were the Elohim, a plural word that unsettles anyone who reads Genesis closely, and the Watchers, angelic figures who descended to a mountain and altered the course of human civilization. In India, they were the Devas, who rode vimanas through the sky and wielded weapons described in terms that sound uncomfortably like fusion warheads. In Mesoamerica, they were Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha, pale and bearded strangers who arrived from across the sea or down from the stars, taught agriculture and mathematics, and then departed with a promise to return. The names change, the languages change, the continents and the centuries separate these accounts by thousands of miles and thousands of years, and yet the pattern does not change. This is the strangeness that this script exists to explore. Not whether these stories are literally true in every detail, but why so many unconnected cultures, with no contact with one another, produced remarkably similar accounts of luminous, technologically advanced beings who descended from the sky, intervened in human affairs, and were worshipped as divine. The term Shining Ones is not a modern invention created for the purposes of speculation. It appears, in one form or another, embedded directly in the oldest religious vocabularies on Earth. The Sumerian word for these beings, when it appears in cuneiform tablets, is often rendered as the Bright Ones or the Radiant Ones. The Egyptian hieroglyphic term for their gods, Netjer, is frequently associated with brightness, sharpness, and a kind of piercing clarity that ancient Egyptians linked to celestial light. In Hebrew, the Watchers are called the Iron, but their appearance, whenever it is described in extra-biblical texts like the Book of Enoch, is consistently one of blinding radiance, faces like lightning, and garments too bright to look upon directly. The Zoroastrian Amesha Spentas, the bounteous immortals who surround Ahura Mazda, are beings of fire and light by definition, their very name tied to luminosity and holy brilliance. Even in cultures separated by the entire breadth of the Pacific Ocean, the association between divinity and radiant, artificial-seeming light persists with an insistence that becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence once the pattern is laid out side by side. The hypothesis this script investigates, often referred to under the broader umbrella of the ancient astronaut theory or paleocontact hypothesis, proposes a reframing of these ancient encounters. It suggests that when Bronze Age and Iron Age humans described beings who arrived in flying vessels, who wore garments of light, who possessed powers over life, death, and the elements, who demanded specific rituals and offerings, and who eventually withdrew from direct contact with humanity while promising a future return, they may have been describing real encounters with an advanced, non-human intelligence, lacking the vocabulary, the scientific framework, or the conceptual categories to describe advanced technology. Ancient witnesses reached for the only language available to them, the language of divinity. A being who could fly was a god. A being who could heal with a touch or destroy a city with a word was divine. A being who came from the sky, glowing, was an angel. This is not a claim that ancient people were unintelligent or credulous by nature. It is a claim that they were rational observers, describing extraordinary phenomena using the interpretive framework their culture had available, in precisely the same way a person from a pre-industrial society encountering a helicopter for the first time might reasonably describe it as a fire-breathing metal bird rather than an aircraft. What makes this hypothesis worth taking seriously as a subject of investigation rather than dismissing outright is not any single piece of evidence, but the sheer density and cross-cultural consistency of the pattern. If only one ancient culture told stories of sky beings who taught them writing, agriculture, and law, the story could be explained away easily as a localized myth, a metaphor for the dawn of civilization, or a psychological projection of unknown natural forces onto anthropomorphic figures. But when Sumerians, Egyptians, Hebrews, Vedic Indians, Persians, Greeks, Chinese, Mesoamericans, and Andean civilizations all independently produced strikingly similar narratives, the explanation of pure coincidence becomes harder to sustain. Either these cultures were in contact with one another to a degree historians have not yet fully mapped, or human psychology tends to generate the same mythological structures regardless of location, or, as the ancient astronaut hypothesis proposes, these cultures were describing the same set of visitors from a common external source, encountered independently across different regions and eras. Skeptics of this hypothesis, and it is important to state their position clearly and fairly, argue that shared mythological structures across cultures are better explained by what anthropologists call diffusionism, the gradual spread of stories along trade routes and migration paths over millennia, combined with what psychologists call the universality of human cognitive patterns. Carl Jung's theory of archetypes suggested that certain symbolic structures, including skyfathers, mother goddesses, and divine messengers, are baked into the human unconscious regardless of culture, arising naturally from shared human experiences like birth, death, the movement of the sun and stars, and the awe inspired by storms, volcanoes, and other natural phenomena. Mainstream historians and archaeologists point out that ancient people had every reason to personify natural forces as divine beings without any need for actual extraterrestrial contact, since lightning, comets, eclipses, and other celestial events were genuinely mysterious and frightening to people without modern astronomy. This script does not ask the viewer to abandon that skepticism. It asks the viewer to hold both explanations in mind, to examine the evidence as it has survived in texts, artifacts, and architecture, and to consider whether the conventional explanation fully accounts for the specificity of certain details that recur across unconnected civilizations. Consider for a moment the specificity of some of these recurring details, because it is in the specifics, not the broad strokes, that the pattern becomes most compelling to those who study it. It is one thing for multiple cultures to imagine a sky father who controls the weather. Storms are universal, and a personified storm god is a fairly obvious invention for any agricultural society dependent on rain. It is another thing entirely for multiple unconnected cultures to describe their gods as arriving in vehicles that hover, that produce fire and smoke, that make a thunderous noise, and that are described using architectural terms like chambers, wheels within wheels, and levels or floors. It is another thing for multiple unconnected cultures to describe their divine visitors as physically altering human beings, either by breeding with human women to produce a hybrid race of giants, as described in the Book of Genesis and expanded upon in the Book of Enoch, or by directly sculpting the first humans from a combination of earthly clay and divine blood or essence, as described in the Sumerian Atrahasis epic and Enuma Elish. It is another thing for multiple unconnected cultures to describe cataclysmic floods sent by the gods specifically to destroy a humanity that had grown too numerous, too noisy, or too similar to the gods themselves, with a single family preserved in a vessel to repopulate the earth afterward, a narrative structure shared by the Sumerian, Babylonian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, and multiple Mesoamerican traditions, each developed, as far as conventional history can determine, independently of the others. This script will walk through these civilizations one at a time, in roughly the chronological order in which their written records first appear, beginning with Sumer, the oldest civilization for which we possess written texts, and moving forward through Egypt, the Levant, India, Persia, Greece, Mesoamerica, and China. In each case, the approach will be the same. First, the primary source material will be presented as it survives, in translation, drawing from cuneiform tablets, papyri, scripture, epic poetry, and oral traditions later committed to writing. Second, the conventional historical and religious interpretation of that material will be summarized, giving proper weight to the scholarly consensus. Third, the ancient astronaut interpretation will be laid alongside the conventional one, highlighting the specific details that proponents of the hypothesis point to as evidence of something more than simple myth-making. The goal is not to tell the viewer what to conclude, but to present the full pattern, civilization by civilization, so that by the end of this journey, the cross-cultural consistency can be evaluated as a whole, rather than dismissed piecemeal, one isolated myth at a time. It is worth pausing here to address directly the origin of the specific phrase this script is built around, the Shining Ones. The phrase has been used by multiple researchers and authors over the past several decades, most notably in the context of comparative mythology, examining beings of light who appear as intermediaries between humanity and a higher cosmic order. It draws on a genuinely ancient linguistic root. The Hebrew word for the Watchers, when examined alongside related Semitic and Akkadian terms, connects etymologically to concepts of brightness and vigilance, beings who watch from a position of elevated luminous authority. Similarly, the term used in later esoteric and Gnostic traditions to describe the archons, the cosmic administrators who some Gnostic texts claim fashion the material world and control human perception, carries connotations of authority tied to light and fire, though the archons are frequently described in more ambivalent or even hostile terms than the Watchers or the Anunnaki. Across these traditions, the association between divine or quasi-divine beings and literal, physical radiance is not a poetic flourish added by later storytellers. It appears at the earliest layers of the textual record, suggesting that whatever experience generated these accounts, the element of light, whether interpreted as a halo, an aura, a glowing garment, or an actual luminous body, was central to it from the beginning. One more foundational concept needs to be established before this script moves into the civilization by civilization survey, and that is the distinction between three related but distinct categories of being that appear across these mythologies, categories that are often collapsed together in popular discussions of ancient aliens, but which deserve to be treated separately for the sake of analytical clarity. The first category consists of what might be called the progenitors or creators, beings directly credited with the creation or genetic modification of the human species. This category includes the Anunnaki figures Enki and Ninhursag in the Sumerian tradition, who are credited with fashioning the first humans, and the Elohim in the opening chapters of Genesis, who create humanity in their own image, a phrase that has generated centuries of theological debate, but which ancient astronaut theorists interpret quite literally as a genetic or physical resemblance rather than a purely spiritual one. The second category consists of the teachers or culture bringers, beings who arrive after humanity already exists in a relatively primitive state and who impart specific technologies, agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and metallurgy. This category includes Thoth in Egypt, Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, Oannes in the Babylonian tradition as recorded by the historian Berossus, and Prometheus in Greek mythology. The third category consists of the Watchers or Guardians, beings tasked with observing humanity, sometimes intervening directly, sometimes withholding intervention, and often associated with punishment, judgment, or the maintenance of cosmic order. This category includes the biblical Watchers of Genesis 6 and the Book of Enoch, the archangels of the Abrahamic traditions, and certain classes of Deva in Vedic cosmology. These three categories are not always neatly separated in the original texts, and a single figure can sometimes occupy more than one role. But keeping this framework in mind will help make sense of the recurring cast of characters this script will introduce as it moves from culture to culture. The journey ahead spans roughly 5,000 years of recorded human history, and if the ancient astronaut hypothesis is taken seriously, even as a thought experiment, an unknown span of prehistory before that. It will take us from the ziggurats of Uruk to the pyramids of Giza, from the mountain where the Watchers descended to swear their oath, to the battlefields of the Mahabharata where weapons of fire consumed entire armies, to the Andean highlands where Viracocha is said to have walked out of Lake Titicaca and reshaped the world in a single night. Along the way, this script will not shy away from presenting the strongest counter-arguments available from mainstream archaeology, linguistics, and comparative religion, because a fair examination of any hypothesis requires engaging honestly with the case against it, not merely cherry-picking the evidence that supports a predetermined conclusion. What this script will argue, in the end, is not that the ancient astronaut hypothesis has been proven beyond doubt, but that the density, specificity, and cross-cultural consistency of these accounts deserve more serious consideration than they typically receive, and that the beings described across these traditions as gods, angels, and demons may, in fact, be a single phenomenon, encountered independently by dozens of civilizations across thousands of years, and remembered, in every case, as beings who shone. We begin, as any serious investigation of this subject must, in the land between two rivers, in the world's first cities, with the world's oldest written records of gods who came down from the sky. Mesopotamia I, the Anunnaki and the Sumerian king list. In the marshy floodplain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in a region the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, meaning the land between the rivers, the world's first cities rose out of the mud roughly 6,000 years ago. Uruk, Eridu, Ur, Nippur, and Lagash were not villages or scattered settlements, but genuine urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands, monumental temple architecture, organized bureaucracy, and critically for our purposes, the world's first writing system. Cuneiform, wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus was developed in Sumer for the mundane purpose of tracking grain shipments and temple inventories, but within a few centuries it had become sophisticated enough to record law codes, epic poetry, astronomical observations, and, most relevantly here, detailed genealogies and histories of the gods the Sumerians believed had founded their civilization. These gods were known collectively as the Anunnaki, a term that appears throughout Sumerian and later Akkadian and Babylonian texts, and whose name is generally translated as those of royal blood, or, in an alternative and more provocative reading favored by ancient astronaut researchers, those who from heaven to earth came. The Anunnaki were not a vague pantheon of abstract nature deities in the way that, say, later Greek philosophy sometimes reimagined its own gods as personifications of natural forces. The Sumerian texts describe them with startling specificity as individuals with names, personalities, rivalries, family relationships, territories, and areas of technical expertise. At the head of this pantheon stood An, sometimes rendered Anu, the sky god and nominal ruler of the Anunnaki, though he is frequently depicted as a somewhat remote figure who delegates practical authority to his sons. Chief among those sons were Enlil, god of air, storms, and the earth's surface, who held the tablets of destiny and functioned as the effective executive authority among the Anunnaki, and Enki, god of the fresh waters, wisdom, and, most importantly for the mythology surrounding the creation of humanity, the god most directly associated with crafting and shaping living beings. These two brothers, Enlil and Enki, appear again and again throughout Sumerian and Akkadian literature, locked in a complex and often adversarial relationship, with Enki repeatedly acting as humanity's advocate and protector against Enlil's harsher judgments, a dynamic that becomes centrally important when we reach the Sumerian flood narrative later in this script. One of the most striking documents to survive from ancient Mesopotamia is the Sumerian king list, a text that catalogs the rulers of Sumerian cities, stretching back, according to the list itself, to a time before a great flood. The king list states plainly that kingship was lowered from heaven, first at the city of Eridu, and it then proceeds to list a sequence of kings who reigned for periods of time that are, by any modern standard, simply impossible for human beings. The king Alulim of Eridu is credited with a reign of 28,800 years. His successor, Al-Algar, reigned for 36,000 years. Other antediluvian kings on the list are credited with reigns in the tens of thousands of years, figures that mainstream Assyriologists generally interpret as symbolic, exaggerated, or the product of a now poorly understood numerical or calendrical system rather than literal chronological claims. This is a reasonable and widely accepted scholarly position. But it is worth noting that ancient astronaut researchers have proposed an alternative reading, suggesting that these numbers might represent an accurate count of a different unit of time, one associated with an orbital period rather than a single Earth year, and that the beings described as ruling during this period were not exaggerated human kings at all, but the Anunnaki themselves, ruling directly over early human settlements before delegating authority to human proxies. This reading remains highly speculative and is not accepted by mainstream historians, but it is a direct and often cited example of how the same primary source material can be interpreted in radically different ways depending on the framework brought to it. The figure most associated with popularizing the ancient astronaut interpretation of the Anunnaki is the author Zecharia Sitchin, whose series of books beginning in the late 1970s argued that the Anunnaki were literal extraterrestrial beings from a planet he called Nibiru, which he claimed followed a long elliptical orbit that brought it into the inner solar system only once every roughly 3,600 years. According to Sitchin's interpretation of Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki came to Earth several 100,000 years ago, initially to mine gold, which Sitchin claimed they needed to repair their home planet's deteriorating atmosphere, and later genetically engineered early hominids by combining Anunnaki genetic material with that of Homo erectus to create Homo sapiens as a labor force. It is important to state clearly that Sitchin's specific translations and interpretations of the underlying Sumerian and Akkadian texts have been extensively and rigorously criticized by professional Assyriologists and linguists, who argue that Sitchin's readings of key terms, including the word commonly translated as Nibiru itself, do not hold up under close philological scrutiny, and that Sitchin was not trained in Sumerian or Akkadian to the standard required for the kind of technical translation work his theories depend upon. This script presents Sitchin's interpretation not because it has been validated by mainstream scholarship, since it has not, but because it remains the single most influential and widely circulated version of the ancient astronaut hypothesis as applied to Mesopotamia, and any serious survey of this subject has to engage with it directly rather than pretending it does not exist. Setting aside the specific and contested details of Sitchin's Nibiru hypothesis, the underlying primary source material from Sumer remains genuinely strange and worth examining on its own terms. The Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest and most complete surviving Mesopotamian creation narratives, describes a period before the creation of humanity in which the lesser gods, referred to as the Igigi, were forced to perform hard physical labor, digging irrigation canals and working the land on behalf of the senior Anunnaki. After several thousand years of this labor, the Igigi rebelled, surrounding Enlil's temple and refusing to continue their work. In response, the god Enki proposed a solution: the creation of a new being, a primitive worker, to take over the burden of labor from the Igigi. This new being, humanity, was created by mixing clay with the flesh and blood of a slain god, a detail that appears with remarkable consistency across multiple Mesopotamian creation texts, and which ancient astronaut proponents interpret as an ancient, garbled memory of genetic engineering, the combination of an existing biological template, the clay representing early hominid or earthly biological material, with an additional genetic component contributed directly by the Anunnaki themselves. The conventional scholarly interpretation treats this account as a theological and social narrative, explaining humanity's purpose as service to the gods and reflecting the very real social hierarchy of ancient Mesopotamian society, where a ruling class was supported by the labor of a working class, projected backward onto a divine template. The birth goddess figure in these narratives, sometimes called Ninhursag, sometimes Ninma, sometimes Mami, is described as playing a direct hands-on role in this creation process, pinching off pieces of clay, mixing them with the divine blood, and shaping the resulting mixture into 14 pieces, 7 of which become the template for human males and 7 for human females. Some versions of the text describe repeated attempts at this creation process, with earlier iterations producing flawed or defective beings before a viable template is achieved, a detail that ancient astronaut researchers frequently point to as consistent with a genuine process of biological experimentation and refinement, rather than a single instantaneous act of divine creation. Whether one accepts the ancient astronaut reading or the conventional mythological reading, the text itself is unambiguous in describing something closer to a deliberate manufacturing process than a spontaneous miracle, and this framing humanity as a manufactured product rather than a spontaneously created being recurs with notable consistency across the Mesopotamian textual tradition. The city of Eridu, identified by the Sumerian king list as the very first city where kingship descended from heaven, has been excavated extensively by archaeologists, and its findings are worth noting here. Eridu's earliest temple layers, some of the oldest religious structures yet discovered anywhere on Earth, were dedicated to Enki, and the site shows a continuous history of temple construction and reconstruction across thousands of years, with each new temple built directly on top of the ruins of the previous one, a pattern common across Mesopotamian religious sites and generally interpreted by archaeologists as reflecting the sustained sacred significance of a specific location rather than any literal connection to a landing site or base of operations for non-human visitors, though this latter interpretation has been proposed by some ancient astronaut researchers who point to the deliberate, repeated selection of the same specific coordinates across millennia as suggestive of a location with some prior significance beyond ordinary religious continuity. Beyond Eridu, the broader Mesopotamian textual tradition preserves the figure of Oannes, described by the Babylonian priest and historian Berossus, writing in Greek in the 3rd century BCE, but drawing on much older Babylonian source material, as a being who emerged from the Persian Gulf in the earliest days of human history. Berossus describes Oannes as having the body of a fish, combined with a human head beneath the fish head and human feet extending from the fish tail, and states that this being spoke with a human voice, moved among men during the daylight hours without eating, and taught humanity the arts of writing, mathematics, agriculture, city building, and law before returning to the sea each evening. Berossus further states that after Oannes, several other similar beings appeared over the following millennia, each reinforcing and expanding upon the same body of civilizing knowledge. The conventional interpretation of Oannes treats this figure as a mythological personification of the sea and the civilizing influence of early maritime trade and irrigation technology on Mesopotamian development. The ancient astronaut interpretation treats the fish and human composite description as a possible garbled memory of some kind of protective suit or diving apparatus worn by a visitor, with the fish component representing an artificial covering rather than a literal biological hybrid, and the repeated pattern of teacher figures returning to the water each night as consistent with a base of operations separate from ordinary human settlements. The broader theme that emerges from the Sumerian and Akkadian material, regardless of which interpretive framework one applies to it, is a consistent portrayal of the Anunnaki not as distant, abstract deities to be worshipped from afar, but as active, present, and frequently quite involved administrators of human civilization in its earliest stages. Sumerian temples, called ziggurats, were understood by the Sumerians themselves not merely as places of worship, but as literal residences for the gods, structures built with a raised platform at the top, specifically intended to house the god's presence when that god chose to visit or dwell among the people. The Sumerian term for these temple complexes translates roughly to House of the God, and temple economies in cities like Uruk and Lagash functioned as genuine administrative centers, with the god understood as the actual owner and manager of the city's agricultural surplus, redistributed through a priestly bureaucracy that, in the earliest periods, may have been functionally indistinguishable from ordinary secular governance. Ancient astronaut researchers point to this arrangement. Gods who require physical dwelling structures, who administer agricultural surplus through a managed bureaucracy, and who are described as regularly present and involved in the daily operation of these early cities as more consistent with a physically present, resource-extracting, occupying presence than with a purely spiritual, abstract object of religious devotion. It is worth closing this examination of the Mesopotamian material with a brief look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, the most famous work of Sumerian and later Akkadian literature to survive into the modern era because it preserves one of the clearest and most influential accounts of a devastating global flood sent by the gods, survived by a single righteous man and his family, who are forewarned by a sympathetic deity and instructed to build a vessel to preserve human and animal life. This flood narrative, associated in different versions of Mesopotamian literature with the figures Utnapishtim, Atrahasis, and Ziusudra, predates the biblical account of Noah by well over 1,000 years and shares with it a remarkable number of specific structural details: divine warning, a vessel built to precise measurements, the preservation of animal life alongside human life, a period of storm and inundation, the vessel coming to rest on a mountain, and the release of birds to determine whether dry land has reappeared. This flood narrative will be examined in far greater depth later in this script, when we turn to a dedicated comparison of flood traditions across every major ancient civilization, because the flood motif, more than almost any other single element of ancient mythology, provides some of the strongest cross-cultural evidence for either a shared prehistoric memory of an actual catastrophic event or a genuinely universal human psychological pattern. Or, as the ancient astronaut hypothesis proposes, a deliberate and coordinated intervention by beings with the technological capacity both to cause and to survive a catastrophe on a civilizational scale. What the Mesopotamian material establishes, at minimum, is the template against which nearly every subsequent civilization we will examine in this script can be measured. Gods who are not abstract but specific, individual, and named. Gods who create or fundamentally modify humanity through what is described in explicitly physical, almost manufacturing-oriented terms. Gods who require physical structures to dwell in and who administer human society through direct, ongoing involvement, rather than distant oversight. Gods whose displeasure with humanity manifests in catastrophic, near-extinction level events, tempered by the intervention of a more sympathetic figure who preserves a remnant of humanity to continue forward. This template, established in the very oldest written records human civilization possesses, recurs with startling consistency as we move next to the Nile Valley, where the Egyptians developed their own account of divine rulers who governed during a mythical age before recorded history, an age they called Zep-Tepi the first time. Mesopotamia too, Enki, Enlil, and the engineering of man. To understand why ancient astronaut researchers place so much weight on the Sumerian material, it is necessary to look more closely at Enki himself, the figure most consistently credited across Mesopotamian literature with hands-on responsibility for shaping, refining, and ultimately preserving humanity. Enki's domain was the Abzu, a term that referred both to the cosmic body of fresh water believed to lie beneath the earth and to Enki's actual temple complex at Eridu, built directly above the springs that fed the city's irrigation system. The word Abzu is frequently rendered in later Akkadian as Apsu, and it carries a double meaning that has intrigued researchers on both sides of this debate. It refers simultaneously to a literal source of water and to a place of deep, hidden knowledge, a place where creation itself was thought to occur. Enki is described throughout Sumerian literature not primarily as a warrior or a king in the mold of Enlil, but as an engineer, a craftsman, and a source of technical knowledge, credited with establishing the fundamental technologies and social institutions referred to in Sumerian texts as the Mi, a term scholars translate variously as divine decrees, cosmic ordinances, or, in a more provocative reading, something closer to a technical blueprint or operating instructions for civilization itself. The Sumerian poem, Inanna and the God of Wisdom, describes Enki possessing over 100 distinct Mi, covering everything from kingship and priesthood to specific crafts, musical instruments, sexual practices, and even categories of deceit and conflict, suggesting a comprehensive, almost encyclopedic system of knowledge under his direct control. The relationship between Enki and Enlil, touched on briefly in the previous section, deserves fuller examination here because it forms the emotional and narrative backbone of nearly every surviving Mesopotamian account of humanity's creation and near destruction. Where Enlil is consistently portrayed as concerned primarily with maintaining cosmic and social order, frequently to the point of ruthlessness, Enki is consistently portrayed as sympathetic to humanity, willing to bend or break the rules established by the senior Anunnaki Council in order to protect human beings from destruction. This dynamic reaches its clearest expression in the flood narrative, where Enlil, frustrated by the noise and overpopulation of the human race, a detail worth pausing on because it appears in strikingly similar form across multiple, separately preserved versions of the text, decides that humanity must be destroyed entirely. Enki, bound by an oath not to directly reveal the god's plans to any human being, circumvents this restriction through a technicality. Rather than speaking directly to Atrahasis, he speaks to the reed wall of Atrahasis's house, knowing that Atrahasis is on the other side and will overhear the warning. This narrative device, a divine being technically honoring an oath while functionally violating its spirit in order to save humanity, is treated by ancient astronaut researchers as evidence of a genuine factional split among the Anunnaki themselves, with Enki functioning less as an all-powerful deity acting according to unlimited divine will, and more as an individual actor operating within a chain of command and a set of binding restrictions he cannot simply override. A portrayal researchers argue is more consistent with a technologically advanced but still socially and hierarchically organized visiting group than with an omnipotent, supernatural pantheon. The Sumerian and later Babylonian texts preserve a specific class of beings closely associated with Enki known as the Apkallu, often translated as the Seven Sages. According to the Babylonian priest Berossus, whose account of Oannes was introduced in the previous section, Oannes was the first of these Apkallu, and 6 further sages appeared in succession over the following millennia, each associated with a specific antediluvian king, and each credited with transmitting additional portions of civilized knowledge to humanity. Mesopotamian art depicts the Apkallu in a highly distinctive and consistent visual form. Figures wearing fish-skin cloaks that drape over their human bodies like a cape or hood, often shown carrying a bucket in one hand and a pine cone-shaped object in the other, a combination of imagery that appears on cylinder seals, temple reliefs, and protective clay figurines buried beneath the foundations of Mesopotamian buildings across a span of well over 1,000 years. The conventional scholarly interpretation of the bucket and pinecone imagery associates it with ritual purification, ceremonial sprinkling of sacred water using the pinecone as an aspergillum, a practical religious tool rather than any kind of advanced instrument. The ancient astronaut interpretation, considerably more speculative and not supported by any Assyriological consensus, proposes that this consistent visual pairing might represent the depiction of some kind of technical apparatus, a device associated with the Mi, the transmission of knowledge, or even, in the most extreme versions of this argument, biological or genetic material, though it must be stated plainly that this reading has no support in the philological or archaeological literature and remains firmly within the realm of speculative reinterpretation rather than established fact. The figure of Adapa, one of the human Apkallu credited with founding the priestly line at Eridu, provides one of the most psychologically resonant myths to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, and one that bears an intriguing structural resemblance to the biblical account of the Garden of Eden that we will examine in detail in a later section of this script. According to the surviving fragments of the Adapa myth, Adapa was granted immense wisdom by Enki, but was deliberately withheld from immortality. In the most complete surviving version of the story, Adapa breaks the wing of the south wind in anger and is summoned before Anu, the senior sky god, to answer for this offense. Enki warns Adapa in advance not to eat or drink anything offered to him in the heavenly court, claiming it will be food and water of death. When Adapa arrives before Anu, however, Anu offers him instead the bread and water of eternal life, precisely the opposite of what Enki predicted. Following Enki's instructions exactly, Adapa refuses the offering and in doing so, forfeits humanity's one clear opportunity to obtain immortality directly from the senior Anunnaki authority. Scholars have long debated whether Enki's warning was a genuine mistake, a deliberate deception intended to keep humanity mortal and therefore more easily controlled, or a test of obedience that Adapa, in a sense, both passed and lost simultaneously. Ancient astronaut researchers frequently cite this narrative as a second, independent Mesopotamian account, alongside the Genesis narrative of the Tree of Life, of a moment when a controlling authority made a deliberate decision to withhold biological longevity from humanity, and they argue that a consistent cross-cultural anxiety about human beings gaining unrestricted access to extended lifespan or immortality suggests an underlying, shared historical memory of some genuine biological or technological barrier that ancient visitors were unwilling to cross. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic distinct from though related to the Sumerian material already discussed, introduces another layer to this examination, because unlike the Atrahasis epic, the Enuma Elish frames its narrative explicitly in cosmic and astronomical terms before it ever turns to the creation of humanity. The epic describes a primordial state consisting of the mingling of fresh water, personified as the god Apsu, and salt water, personified as the goddess Tiamat, from which successive generations of gods are born. A younger generation of gods, growing louder and more chaotic, provokes Apsu to plan their destruction, a plan that is discovered and turned against him, resulting in his death at the hands of Enki. Tiamat, in grief and fury, assembles an army of monstrous beings and moves to destroy the younger gods. In turn, a conflict ultimately resolved when the god Marduk offered supreme kingship among the gods in exchange for confronting Tiamat, defeats her in single combat, and splits her body into two halves, using one half to form the sky and the other to form the earth. Zecharia Sitchin, whose interpretive framework was introduced in the previous section, argued extensively that the Enuma Elish should be read not as a theological creation myth, but as a garbled astronomical record of an actual celestial collision within our solar system, with Tiamat representing a planet that once occupied the space now filled by the asteroid belt, and Marduk representing an intruding celestial body, potentially the planet Sitchin called Nibiru, whose passage through the inner solar system caused this ancient planet to be shattered, with half its mass forming the asteroid belt and the other half becoming Earth. This interpretation, like the broader Nibiru hypothesis it depends upon, is not accepted by mainstream astronomers or Assyriologists, who point out that it requires a highly selective and non-standard translation of key astronomical terms in the text, and that the Enuma Elish's primary purpose within Babylonian religious and political life was to legitimize Marduk's elevation to the head of the Babylonian pantheon, coinciding with Babylon's own rise to political dominance in Mesopotamia, a straightforward and well-documented instance of religious narrative reflecting contemporary political reality rather than encoding literal astronomical history. Regardless of how one evaluates Sitchin's specific astronomical claims, the Enuma Elish's account of the creation of humanity, which occurs only after the cosmic battle between Marduk and Tiamat has concluded, reinforces the pattern already established in the Atrahasis epic. Marduk proposes creating humanity specifically to relieve the gods of their labor, and Ea, an alternate name for Enki used in the Babylonian tradition, executes this plan by slaying Kingu, the commander of Tiamat's army and, notably, the bearer of the Tablets of Destiny, and using his blood, mixed once again with clay, to fashion the first humans. The repeated insistence across multiple independently composed Mesopotamian texts spanning well over 1,000 years of literary development that humanity was created specifically from a combination of earthly material and the blood, flesh, or essence of a slain or sacrificed divine being is treated by ancient astronaut researchers as one of the single strongest pieces of internal textual evidence for their hypothesis, since a straightforward act of miraculous creation of the kind described in many other world mythologies would not obviously require this specific and consistently repeated detail of a biological donor, whether that donor is willing, as in some readings of Enki's role, or unwilling, as in the case of the slain king. Before this examination of Mesopotamia concludes, it is worth briefly addressing the visual and artistic record left behind by Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian civilization, because this record, preserved on thousands of cylinder seals, temple reliefs, and boundary stones, contains a recurring set of images that have become central to popular ancient astronaut discourse. Chief among these is the so-called winged disk, a circular or oval symbol flanked by outstretched wings, frequently shown hovering above kings, gods, or significant events, and appearing not only in Mesopotamia, but, as we will see in the next part of this script, throughout Egyptian religious art as well. The conventional archaeological interpretation of the winged disk identifies it as a solar symbol, representing the sun god's protective presence and connecting the ruling king's authority to divine sanction from the sky, an interpretation well supported by accompanying inscriptions that explicitly identify the symbol with specific solar deities in both Mesopotamian and Egyptian contexts. The ancient astronaut interpretation, considerably more speculative, proposes that the consistent visual structure of the winged disk, a central circular or oval body flanked by symmetrical projecting elements, bears a resemblance to a stylized flying craft, and that its persistent association with divine kingship and its consistent placement above scenes of significant historical or religious importance is consistent with its serving as a genuine symbol of the actual vehicles used by the Anunnaki, gradually abstracted and stylized over centuries of repeated artistic reproduction into a purely solar symbol as direct memory of its original referent faded. It must be stated clearly that no cuneiform inscription anywhere in the Mesopotamian corpus explicitly identifies the winged disk as a vehicle, and the solar interpretation remains the position supported by the overwhelming majority of art historians and Assyriologists who have studied this material. What emerges from this closer examination of Enki, Enlil, and the broader Mesopotamian textual and artistic record is a portrait of a divine hierarchy that is, by ancient standards, remarkably well documented, remarkably specific, and remarkably consistent in certain recurring themes. The deliberate, hands-on creation of humanity from a combination of earthly and divine material, a persistent internal division among the ruling divine authorities over how humanity should be treated, a recurring anxiety about human access to immortality or extended life, and a body of specialized knowledge, the me, transmitted to humanity gradually and deliberately by specific named teacher figures rather than appearing spontaneously. Whether this pattern reflects genuine prehistoric contact with an advanced non-human intelligence, as the ancient astronaut hypothesis proposes, or reflects the sophisticated theological and social imagination of the world's first literate civilization, wrestling with the same fundamental questions about origin, mortality, and knowledge that every human culture eventually confronts, is a question this script leaves for the viewer to weigh, civilization by civilization, as the pattern continues to unfold. We turn now to the Nile, where a civilization developing in relative isolation from Mesopotamia produced its own remarkably similar account of divine rulers, technical knowledge transmitted from the sky, and a golden age before recorded history that the Egyptians themselves called Zep-Tepi the first time. Egypt, I, the Neteru, and the first time, Zep-Tepi, Ancient Egyptian civilization developed along the Nile, largely independently of Mesopotamia, separated by hundreds of miles of desert and, for most of its early history, limited direct contact with the cities of Sumer and Akkad. This independence makes the structural similarities between Egyptian and Mesopotamian religious cosmology all the more striking when they appear, because unlike shared motifs between, say, neighboring Canaanite and Mesopotamian cultures, where direct trade and cultural exchange offer an obvious mechanism for the transmission of ideas, Egypt's own account of divine rulers governing during a mythical age before recorded history developed along its own trajectory, using its own language, its own pantheon, and its own sacred geography, yet arriving at a strikingly similar underlying structure. The Egyptians referred to this foundational period as Zep Tepi, a phrase generally translated as the first time or the first occasion, a golden age during which, according to Egyptian religious tradition, the gods themselves ruled directly over Egypt before delegating authority to a line of divine and semi-divine successors, who in turn eventually gave way to the historical pharaohs whose reigns are documented in the archaeological and textual record we possess today. This is not a marginal or obscure element of Egyptian religious thought. It appears as a foundational assumption across the full span of dynastic Egyptian history, referenced in temple inscriptions, funerary texts, and royal titulature for well over 3,000 years, from the earliest dynastic periods through the Ptolemaic era. Egyptian kings throughout this entire span understood their own authority as a continuation of a chain of legitimate rule stretching back to Zep Tepi, and Egyptian temples were frequently described in their own dedicatory inscriptions as having been founded during this first time itself. Their physical location and orientation understood as sacred precisely because it replicated or preserved the arrangement established by the gods during this primordial age. Two surviving documents provide our clearest window into how the Egyptians themselves understood the chronology of this divine age: the Palermo stone, a fragmentary basalt stela dating to the 5th dynasty that records a king list stretching back before the historical dynasties, and the Turin king list, a papyrus document from the 19th dynasty that provides an even more extensive chronology. Both documents describe, before the reign of the first historical pharaoh conventionally identified as Menes or Narmer, a succession of divine and semi-divine rulers governing Egypt for periods of time that, much like the Sumerian king list examined earlier in this script, extend across spans of thousands, and in some readings of the damaged Turin papyrus, tens of thousands of years. The Turin king list specifically names a sequence of gods as the earliest rulers of Egypt, beginning with Ptah, followed by Ra, Shu, Geb, Osiris, Set, Horus, Thoth, and Ma'at, before transitioning to a subsequent category of rulers the papyrus calls the Shemsu Hor, generally translated as the followers of Horus, described as demigods or spirit beings who governed Egypt for a further extended period before the beginning of properly historical human dynastic rule. The mainstream Egyptological interpretation of this material treats it as a form of theological legitimation, a common and well-documented strategy across many ancient cultures in which a ruling dynasty grounds its authority in an unbroken chain of succession reaching back to the divine origins of kingship itself, reinforcing the pharaoh's status as a living link between the human and divine spheres. This interpretation is well supported by the clear political function these king lists served throughout Egyptian history, legitimizing specific dynasties and specific temple institutions by connecting them directly to this foundational sacred chronology. The ancient astronaut interpretation, without necessarily rejecting this political function outright, argues that the specificity and consistency of this material, gods and demigods ruling for extended, itemized periods before the beginning of properly human history, closely parallels the Sumerian antediluvian king list examined in the previous section of this script, and suggests that both traditions may preserve, in heavily mythologized and numerically distorted form, a genuine memory of an extended period of direct governance by an advanced, non-human presence before the emergence of purely human political authority. The Egyptian term for the gods themselves, Neger in its singular form and Neteru in the plural, deserves closer examination because its underlying meaning has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate. The hieroglyphic determinative most commonly associated with the word netjer depicts a wrapped flagstaff, a symbol understood by most Egyptologists to represent the cloth-wrapped poles that stood outside early Egyptian shrines, marking them as sacred space. However, several Egyptologists, including Sir Wallace Budge in his early 20th century scholarship, have noted that the root of the word netjer carries connotations of sharpness, strength, and vital power, and some researchers have proposed a further connection to concepts of renewal, vigor, and radiant energy, though this latter connection remains debated within professional Egyptology rather than settled fact. Ancient astronaut researchers have seized on this etymological ambiguity and on the broader observation that the Neteru are consistently depicted in Egyptian art with specific non-human physical attributes, animal heads combined with human bodies, unusual proportions, and consistent association with specific colors of skin, including gold, blue, and green, not typically found in ordinary human populations, as evidence that the Neteru may have been remembered as physically, not merely symbolically, distinct from human beings. The conventional Egyptological position holds that these composite animal-human forms functioned symbolically, with each animal chosen to represent specific qualities or domains of authority associated with that deity, a well-documented and internally consistent symbolic system that does not require any assumption of literal physical hybridity to explain. The genealogy of the Egyptian gods, as preserved most completely in the theological system developed at the city of Heliopolis, and known to Egyptologists as the Ennead, or Group of Nine, provides a structural parallel to the Mesopotamian material worth pausing on. According to Heliopolitan theology, the god Adam emerged from the primordial waters of Nun through an act of self-creation, and subsequently produced the first divine pair, Shu, god of air, and Tefnut, goddess of moisture, through an act that different versions of the myth describe variously as spitting, sneezing, or masturbation. Textual variants that Egyptologists generally attribute to phonetic wordplay in the underlying hieroglyphic text, rather than genuine theological inconsistency. Shu and Tefnut, in turn, produced Geb, god of the earth, and Nut, goddess of the sky, whose own union produced the four gods most central to later Egyptian mythology and to the material we will examine in the next section of this script: Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. This genealogical structure, a small number of primordial deities producing successive generations through direct sexual or quasi-sexual reproduction, again parallels the Mesopotamian pattern of successive divine generations examined in the Enuma Elish and establishes Osiris, whose myth cycle will occupy much of the next section, as a fourth-generation deity considerably removed from the original creator god, but still understood as having ruled Egypt directly during Zep-Tepi in fully embodied, physically present form. The pyramid texts, carved into the interior walls of royal burial chambers, beginning with the pyramid of King Unas at the end of the 5th dynasty, represent the oldest substantial body of religious literature to survive from ancient Egypt, and they preserve material that Egyptologists broadly agree reflects considerably older oral and ritual traditions than the physical carvings themselves, potentially extending back to the very earliest phases of Egyptian civilization. These texts are overwhelmingly concerned with a single central goal: ensuring the successful transition of the deceased pharaoh's soul into the company of specific stars, described repeatedly and consistently as the imperishable ones, a term Egyptologists identify with the circumpolar stars, those stars near the celestial North Pole that, from Egypt's latitude, never set below the horizon and therefore appear to circle eternally without ever dying, an obvious and well-documented symbolic association with the pharaoh's own hoped-for eternal life. The pyramid texts repeatedly describe the pharaoh's soul ascending to the sky by means of a ladder, a staircase, or, in several passages, on smoke or fire, language that ancient astronaut researchers have suggested might preserve a garbled memory of some kind of ascent technology, though the overwhelming majority of Egyptological scholarship treats this imagery as straightforwardly symbolic, consistent with funerary ascent imagery found across numerous unrelated world religious traditions, with no plausible connection to advanced technology of any kind. considerably more contested and worth presenting here because it represents one of the more scientifically grounded strands of alternative Egyptological research, is the Orion correlation theory, developed principally by the engineer and researcher Robert Bauval beginning in the late 1980s. Bauval proposed that the layout of the three main pyramids at the Giza Plateau, traditionally attributed to the 4th dynasty pharaohs Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure, corresponds with notable precision to the arrangement of the three stars forming the belt of the constellation Orion, a constellation the ancient Egyptians associated directly with Osiris. Bauval further argued that the slight offset in the third, smaller pyramid, generally attributed to Menkaure, mirrors a similar offset in the third star of Orion's belt, and that this correspondence extends to the broader arrangement of the Nile itself, which Bauval argued was symbolically understood by the ancient Egyptians as an earthly counterpart to the Milky Way. Bauval, working with the author Adrian Gilbert and later with the more explicitly speculative author Graham Hancock, extended this theory to argue that the Giza pyramid complex was designed to reflect the specific configuration of the sky at a much earlier date than the pyramid's conventional 4th dynasty construction, potentially around 10,500 BCE, a date that, if accepted, would place the underlying architectural design concept, though not necessarily the actual physical construction, at a period many thousands of years before the beginning of any civilization currently recognized by mainstream archaeology as capable of this kind of large-scale, monumental engineering. Mainstream Egyptologists and archaeoastronomers have responded to the Orion correlation theory with substantial and detailed criticism, pointing out significant discrepancies in the claimed stellar alignment when checked against precise astronomical calculation, noting that the correspondence Bauval identifies works considerably less precisely than initially claimed once methodological rigor is applied, and pointing to abundant, well-documented archaeological evidence, including construction ramps, workers' villages, quarry marks, and administrative records, that firmly places the construction of the Giza pyramids within the 4th dynasty, several thousand years after Bauval's proposed 10,500 BCE date. Closely related to this debate is the question of the Great Sphinx's age, a controversy brought to wide public attention by the geologist Robert Schoch, who argued in the early 1990s, based on his analysis of the distinctive weathering patterns visible on the Sphinx's body and surrounding enclosure walls, that the erosion pattern is more consistent with prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall than with the wind and sand erosion that would be expected if the Sphinx had been carved during the conventionally accepted 4th dynasty period, a period during which the Egyptian climate was already predominantly arid. Schoch argued that this rainfall pattern erosion would require the Sphinx's initial carving to date back to a considerably wetter climatic period in Egypt's history, potentially as early as 7,000 to 5,000 BCE, thousands of years before the emergence of any civilization currently recognized as capable of a project on this scale. Mainstream Egyptologists have responded to Schoch's water erosion hypothesis with several substantial counterarguments, including alternative explanations for the weathering pattern involving humidity-driven salt crystallization rather than direct rainfall, the observation that no comparable monumental structure from this hypothesized earlier civilization has ever been discovered, despite extensive archaeological survey of the region, and continued confidence in dating the Sphinx to the 4th dynasty based on stylistic comparison with securely dated Old Kingdom statuary bearing the facial features of King Khafra. This remains an active and genuinely unresolved dispute between Schoch and the mainstream Egyptological community, and it is presented here not as settled evidence for an advanced prehistoric civilization, but as one of the more substantive, credential-backed points of contention within the broader alternative history discourse, distinct in its methodological grounding from more speculative claims like Sitchin's Nibiru hypothesis discussed in the previous section. What both the Orion correlation theory and the Sphinx water erosion hypothesis share, and what makes them worth including in this examination despite their contested status, is a shared underlying claim that Egyptian civilization, as it appears fully formed at the very beginning of the archaeological record, with sophisticated writing, monumental architecture, and complex religious cosmology already in place with no evident period of gradual technological development preceding it, may represent not the beginning of Egyptian civilization, but its inheritance, a continuation and administration of knowledge, architectural technique, and religious cosmology established during the far older and now largely lost age the Egyptians themselves called Zep-Tepi. This sudden appearance problem, the apparent absence of a gradual developmental period leading up to the sophistication of early dynastic Egyptian civilization, is acknowledged as a genuine puzzle even within mainstream Egyptology, though mainstream scholars generally attribute it to gaps in the archaeological record and the loss of perishable early materials, pre-dynastic settlements along the Nile that may have been destroyed by the river's own annual flooding and shifting course over thousands of years, rather than to the intervention of an advanced, non-human or prehistoric human civilization whose direct physical evidence has yet to be discovered. We will return to Egypt in the next section of this script to examine two specific figures who occupy an especially prominent place in both the conventional and the ancient astronaut readings of Egyptian religion. Thoth, the god most directly and consistently associated across Egyptian sources with the invention and transmission of writing, mathematics, and esoteric knowledge, and Osiris, whose death, dismemberment, and resurrection myth forms the single most important religious narrative in the entirety of ancient Egyptian civilization, and whose story, when examined closely, bears a series of specific structural details that ancient astronaut researchers argue extend well beyond ordinary mythological convention. Egypt 2. Thoth, Osiris, and the technology of the gods. If any single deity in the Egyptian pantheon occupies a role directly comparable to Enki's position within the Mesopotamian tradition, that deity is Thoth, consistently depicted with the head of an ibis, or, in certain contexts, in the form of a baboon, and credited across the full span of Egyptian religious history with the invention of writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and the entire body of sacred and magical knowledge the Egyptians called Heka. Egyptian tradition held that Thoth served as the official scribe and record keeper of the gods themselves, present at the weighing of the heart ceremony described in the Book of the Dead, in which the deceased's heart was placed on a scale against the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth and cosmic order, with Thoth recording the verdict that would determine the soul's fate. This role as record keeper and arbiter of judgment placed Thoth in a position of considerable authority within Egyptian cosmology, an authority frequently described as deriving not from martial or political power in the manner of Osiris or Horus, but specifically from Thoth's possession and mastery of secret, precise, and comprehensive knowledge. Egyptian tradition credited Thoth directly with the invention of hieroglyphic writing itself, a claim preserved in multiple sources, including the Greek philosopher Plato's dialogue Phaedrus, in which Plato recounts an Egyptian tradition attributing the invention of writing, along with mathematics, astronomy, and games of chance, to a god the Egyptians called Thoth, whom later Greek sources consistently identified with Thoth. This same association between Thoth and the transmission of technical, civilizing knowledge appears throughout the later Hermetic tradition, a body of Greco-Egyptian philosophical and mystical texts composed primarily during the first few centuries of the Common Era, which merged Thoth with the Greek god Hermes to create the syncretic figure Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the Thrice Great, credited as the author of an extensive body of esoteric writing on alchemy, astrology, and theology. It is important to state clearly, for the sake of historical accuracy, that the specific text popularly known as the Emerald Tablet, frequently cited in discussions of ancient lost technology and often attributed directly to an ancient Egyptian Thoth figure, does not actually derive from ancient Egyptian sources at all. Its earliest known appearance is in medieval Arabic alchemical literature, likely composed sometime between the 6th and 8th centuries of the Common Era, and it entered European intellectual tradition through later Latin translation during the medieval period. While the broader Hermetic tradition does draw on genuine elements of Greco-Egyptian religious syncretism dating back to antiquity, the Emerald Tablet specifically should be understood as a medieval composition operating within an invented ancient Egyptian frame story, not as an authentic surviving artifact of pharaonic Egyptian civilization. a distinction frequently blurred or ignored in popular treatments of this material. Setting aside the later and considerably more speculative Hermetic accretions, the core Egyptological record regarding Thoth remains genuinely striking in its own right, because Thoth is consistently portrayed across a documented span of well over 3,000 years of continuous Egyptian religious practice as possessing and controlling a body of technical knowledge understood by the Egyptians themselves as powerful enough to reshape reality, to heal the sick, to resurrect the dead, and to grant victory in cosmic conflict. In several versions of the Osiris myth cycle, which we now turn to directly, it is specifically Thoth's knowledge and magical assistance that proves decisive in restoring order after the central catastrophe of Egyptian mythology, the murder of Osiris by his brother Set. The Osiris myth, though never preserved in a single complete surviving Egyptian text, and instead reconstructed by modern scholars from fragments scattered across the pyramid texts, the later coffin texts, various temple inscriptions, and most completely from the Greek writer Plutarch's account composed in the 1st century of the Common Era, describes Osiris as an early and benevolent ruler of Egypt, who, together with his sister wife Isis, taught the Egyptian people agriculture, law, and the arts of civilization, echoing precisely the culture-bringer role occupied by Oannes in the Mesopotamian tradition, and by figures we will encounter later in this script across India, Mesoamerica, and beyond. According to the myth, Osiris's brother Set, driven by jealousy and ambition for the throne, constructed an elaborately decorated chest built to fit Osiris's exact measurements, and at a banquet offered the chest as a gift to whichever guest could fit inside it perfectly. When Osiris climbed in, Set and his co-conspirators sealed the chest and cast it into the Nile, drowning Osiris and setting his body adrift. Isis, grieving and determined, searched for and eventually recovered the chest, but Set discovered his brother's body a second time, and in the most violent escalation of the myth, dismembered Osiris's body into multiple pieces, scattering them across the length of Egypt to prevent any possibility of restoration. Isis, joined in most versions of the myth by her sister Nephthys and assisted directly by Thoth's magical knowledge, undertook a painstaking search across the length of Egypt to recover Osiris's scattered body parts, eventually locating and reassembling all of them with the single exception of his phallus, said to have been swallowed by a fish in the Nile and therefore reconstructed magically rather than physically recovered, using powerful words of magic taught to her either by Thoth directly or drawn from her own considerable magical skill, depending on the version of the myth consulted. Isis reanimated Osiris's reassembled body long enough to conceive their son Horus before Osiris passed permanently into the realm of the dead, becoming the ruler and judge of the underworld, the Duat, while Horus was raised in secret by Isis to eventually grow to adulthood, challenge Set for the throne of Egypt, and, after a prolonged and violent conflict adjudicated eventually by the assembled council of the gods, reclaim his father's throne and establish the template for legitimate pharaonic succession that would define Egyptian kingship for the following 3,000 years. The conventional Egyptological interpretation of this myth treats it as a foundational narrative explaining and legitimizing several core aspects of Egyptian religious and political life simultaneously: the agricultural cycle of the Nile itself, with Osiris's death and dismemberment understood as symbolically representing the annual harvest, and Osiris's resurrection representing the subsequent regrowth of crops from buried seed. The institution of pharaonic succession, with every living pharaoh understood as the earthly embodiment of Horus, and every deceased pharaoh understood as merging with Osiris in the afterlife, and the broader Egyptian theological preoccupation with death, judgment, and the possibility of resurrection that defines so much of surviving Egyptian funerary literature and practice. This interpretation is well supported and widely accepted, and this script does not dispute its validity as the primary and most historically grounded reading of the myth. The ancient astronaut interpretation of the Osiris myth, while not disputing this agricultural and political symbolism outright, focuses instead on several specific structural details that proponents argue exceed what would be strictly necessary for a purely symbolic agricultural narrative. First, the specific and repeated emphasis on dismemberment and subsequent reassembly, rather than a simpler death and rebirth narrative of the kind found in many other agricultural fertility myths across the ancient world, is highlighted as unusual, and some researchers have proposed that this detail might preserve a garbled memory of an advanced medical or technological capability, the ability to reconstruct or repair a physically damaged body using means unavailable to ordinary human practitioners of the period, though it should be noted plainly that this reading requires a considerable interpretive leap beyond anything stated explicitly in the surviving textual sources. Second, researchers point to the Djed pillar, one of the most frequently reproduced symbols in the whole of Egyptian iconography, understood conventionally by Egyptologists as representing Osiris's backbone, or, in an earlier and possibly more original association, a stylized tree trunk or agricultural pole connected to fertility and stability, and associated with a specific and elaborately documented ritual called raising the Djed, performed as part of major royal festivals, including the Sed festival, marking a pharaoh's extended reign. Some ancient astronaut researchers, along with a small number of independent electrical engineers writing outside formal Egyptological training, have proposed, based on the pillar's segmented, cross-hatched visual structure, that the Djed might represent a stylized depiction of some kind of energy-related device, rather than a purely symbolic architectural or organic form, a claim not supported by any Egyptological consensus, unaccompanied by any surviving artifact matching this proposed function, and considered by mainstream Egyptology to rest on a superficial visual resemblance rather than any substantive textual or archaeological evidence. A further detail worth noting in the Osiris myth cycle concerns the ongoing rivalry between Horus and Set following Osiris's death, a conflict the surviving Egyptian sources describe in genuinely extensive and violent detail, including episodes of physical combat, the loss and magical restoration of Horus's eye, an object that itself became one of the most widespread protective symbols in all of Egyptian material culture, and a final legal adjudication before the assembled council of the Ennead. This extended, multi-generational conflict between two divine factions, one associated broadly with order, fertile agricultural land, and legitimate succession, the other associated with chaos, the barren desert, and usurped authority, again mirrors the factional tension between Enki and Enlil examined in the Mesopotamian material, and reinforces a pattern this script will continue to trace across subsequent civilizations. Divine pantheons that are not depicted as harmonious, unified administrations, but as factions in genuine, sustained conflict with one another over the treatment, governance, and ultimate fate of humanity. Before concluding this examination of Egypt, it is worth briefly addressing the sacred site of Heliopolis, center of the Ennead theology introduced in the previous section, and specifically the Benben stone housed there, a pyramidal or conical sacred object regarded by the Egyptians as the primordial mound upon which the creator god Adam first stood at the moment of creation, and from which the later pyramid shape used throughout Egyptian monumental architecture, including the small pyramidion capstones that top the Great Pyramids themselves, is understood by Egyptologists to derive symbolically. The Benben stone was closely associated with the Bennu bird, a heron-like creature, Egyptian tradition credited with the first cry that broke the silence of primordial creation, and which later Greek visitors to Egypt identified with their own phoenix, the mythical bird that dies in flame and is reborn from its own ashes, a myth that entered Greek and subsequently broader Western tradition directly through Egyptian religious influence, and provides one of the clearest and most well-documented examples of genuine cross-cultural transmission of a specific mythological motif from Egypt outward into the broader Mediterranean world. Distinct from the more speculative claims of independent parallel development this script has examined elsewhere, Taken together, the figures of Thoth and Osiris establish within the Egyptian tradition a structure remarkably consistent with what we have already observed in Mesopotamia, a divine hierarchy possessing and jealously guarding advanced technical and magical knowledge, a specific culture-bringer figure credited with the foundational transmission of civilization's core technologies to humanity, a documented internal conflict among the ruling divine authorities with direct and violent consequences for the human political order, and a persistent, culturally central preoccupation with death, resurrection, and the technical or magical means by which the boundary between life and death might be crossed or reversed. Having now examined the two oldest and most extensively documented civilizations in the ancient Near East, this script turns next to a third tradition, geographically situated between the other two and destined to exert influence on Western religious thought disproportionate to its modest size and political power in antiquity, the religious literature of the ancient Israelites, and specifically the opening chapters of the Book of Genesis, where a plural word for God, a forbidden tree, and a race of giants born from the union of divine beings and human women introduce some of the most theologically consequential and, for the purposes of this script, most directly relevant material we will examine in this entire survey. The Levant and the Bible, Elohim, the Watchers, and Genesis 6. The Hebrew Bible presents a particular challenge and a particular opportunity for this investigation because unlike the Sumerian and Egyptian material examined so far, which reached the modern world only through the work of 19th and 20th century archaeologists excavating buried tablets and temple ruins, the biblical text has been continuously read, copied, translated, and studied without interruption for well over 2,000 years. This continuous transmission means the biblical material has been subject to an extraordinary depth of theological interpretation that has, in the view of many researchers examining this subject, gradually smoothed over or reframed details that, read in their most direct and literal sense, align closely with the patterns already established in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The starting point for this examination is a linguistic detail so fundamental that it is often overlooked entirely by casual readers. The very first word used for God in the Hebrew Bible, Elohim, is grammatically plural. In Hebrew, the suffix im typically marks a masculine plural noun, and Elohim, appearing in the opening verse of Genesis, "In the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth," is unambiguously constructed using this plural form. Biblical Hebrew grammar resolves this apparent contradiction, a plural noun paired with a singular verb throughout most of the text, through the concept scholars call the plural of majesty, or plural of intensity, a grammatical convention in which a plural noun form is used to convey greatness, fullness, or totality of power, rather than indicating multiple distinct beings, and this remains the standard and well-supported grammatical explanation accepted across mainstream biblical scholarship and Jewish and Christian theology alike. This script does not dispute the validity of this grammatical explanation. However, the plural of majesty framework becomes considerably harder to sustain as the sole explanation once a reader reaches Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, in which Elohim declares, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness," employing not only a plural noun, but plural pronouns and a plural verb form, a genuinely first-person plural statement that has generated centuries of theological commentary attempting to explain who precisely is included in this us. Traditional Jewish commentary has proposed that God is here addressing the angelic heavenly court, consulting with subordinate divine beings before proceeding with creation, a reading with deep roots in ancient Jewish exegesis, and one that aligns closely with the concept of a divine council that appears at multiple other points throughout the Hebrew Bible, including explicitly in Psalm 82, which opens with the striking declaration, "God stands in the congregation of the mighty, he judges among the gods," language that mainstream biblical scholars increasingly recognize as reflecting the Hebrew Bible's roots within the broader polytheistic religious environment of the ancient Near East, an environment in which a supreme high god, identified in Ugaritic religious texts discovered at the site of ancient Ugarit in modern Syria as El, presided over a council of subordinate divine beings, a structural pattern remarkably similar to An presiding over the Anunnaki Council examined earlier in this script. Ancient astronaut researchers point to this material, the plural creation language, the concept of a divine council, and Psalm 82's startlingly direct reference to God adjudicating among other gods, as evidence that the Hebrew Bible, despite its later and thoroughly developed monotheistic theology, preserves textual layers reflecting an earlier conception of Israel's God as the senior figure within a broader assembly of divine or quasi-divine beings, a structural pattern directly comparable to the Anunnaki Council, headed by An, and the Ennead, headed by Atum, already examined in this script. Mainstream biblical scholars broadly agree with the historical claim that ancient Israelite religion developed gradually out of the polytheistic religious environment of the broader Canaanite and Near Eastern world, evolving toward strict monotheism over the course of many centuries, a well-documented process scholars call the development of Israelite monolatry, worship of a single national god without denying the existence of other gods, and its eventual transition into fully developed monotheism. Where mainstream scholarship and ancient astronaut interpretation diverge is not on the historical existence of this divine council concept within ancient Israelite religion, which is well established, but on whether the beings referenced within that council should be understood as purely mythological and theological constructs, or as a genuine memory filtered through developing Israelite theology of encounters with actual advanced, non-human beings. This question becomes considerably more concrete and specific when we turn to Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, a passage of only 4 verses that has generated an extraordinary and disproportionate volume of theological and speculative commentary across the entire history of biblical interpretation. The passage reads, in essence, that when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose, and that the offspring of these unions were the Nephilim, described as mighty men which were of old, men of renown. The Hebrew phrase rendered sons of God, Bene Elohim, appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, notably in the book of Job, where it clearly and unambiguously refers to divine or angelic beings present in the heavenly court rather than to human beings of any kind, a linguistic parallel that has led many biblical scholars, both ancient and modern, to conclude that Genesis 6 is describing a literal union between angelic or divine beings and human women rather than the alternative interpretation favored by some later theological traditions, which reads sons of God as referring to the righteous line of Seth intermarrying with the ostensibly less righteous line of Cain, an interpretation that gained prominence particularly in later rabbinic and early Christian commentary, partly, many scholars argue, as a deliberate theological effort to move away from the more literal and increasingly uncomfortable angelic interpretation as monotheistic orthodoxy solidified. The word Nephilim itself, appearing here and in one further passage in the book of Numbers describing giant inhabitants of Canaan, derives from a Hebrew root most scholars connect to the verb to fall, suggesting either the fallen ones, possibly referring to beings who fell from heaven, or those who cause others to fall, a description of their fearsome physical stature and martial capability. The King James translation renders Nephilim as giants, a translation choice with ancient precedent, since the Greek Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Bible, completed several centuries before the Christian era, renders the same word using the Greek term gigantes, directly connecting the biblical Nephilim to the same conceptual category as the giants of Greek mythology, offspring of unions between gods and mortals, whom we will examine later in this script when we turn to the Greek material directly. While Genesis 6 itself provides only a brief 4-verse account of this episode, an entire body of extra-biblical literature composed during the Second Temple period and excluded from the eventual Hebrew and Protestant biblical canon, though retained as fully canonical scripture within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, expands this brief account into a considerably more elaborate and detailed narrative. This literature, known collectively as the Book of Enoch or War Enoch, survives in its most complete form in Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia, though substantial Aramaic fragments were also discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, confirming that this material circulated widely and was considered significant within at least some strands of Second Temple Jewish religious thought, well before the rise of Christianity. The Book of Enoch names 200 angelic beings, called Watchers, who descend to the summit of Mount Hermon, a real and specific mountain located on the modern border between Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, and there swear a mutual oath, binding themselves collectively to the plan of taking human wives, a detail the text presents not as an isolated individual transgression, but as a coordinated, deliberate, and collectively agreed-upon act undertaken by an organized group. The text names the leader of this group as Semjaza, and separately names a particularly significant figure called Azazel, credited specifically with teaching humanity the arts of metalworking and weapon-making, along with the manufacture of jewelry and cosmetics, and the associated arts of seduction and adornment that the text presents in a distinctly negative light as corrupting rather than civilizing knowledge, a notable contrast to the broadly positive framing given to comparable culture-bringer figures like Oannes, Enki, and Thoth in the Mesopotamian and Egyptian material already examined. The Book of Enoch describes the offspring of the Watchers and human women as giants of extraordinary size and appetite, who begin consuming all available human food resources and then turn to consuming animals, and eventually, in the text's most disturbing escalation, human beings themselves, provoking a cry of distress from the suffering human population that reaches the heavenly realm and prompts direct divine intervention. In response, God dispatches the archangels, most prominently Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, with a specific set of tasks: to bind the rebellious Watchers, imprisoning them until a final future judgment, to destroy the giant offspring through mutual conflict with one another, and, according to some readings of the text, to send the great flood specifically as a final comprehensive measure to cleanse the earth of the corruption these unions and their resulting violence had produced. This framing, in which the flood functions not merely as a punishment for generalized human wickedness, as the canonical Genesis account somewhat vaguely describes it, but as a specific and targeted response to the genetic and technological corruption introduced by the Watchers, represents one of the most significant expansions the Book of Enoch offers beyond the brief canonical account, and it is this expanded narrative, rather than the sparse 4 verses of Genesis 6 alone, that most ancient astronaut researchers draw upon when constructing their interpretation of this material. The parallels between this narrative and the material already examined in this script are numerous and, to researchers who study this subject, difficult to dismiss as coincidental. The image of a distinct class of divine or semi-divine beings descending from the sky to a specific, named physical location, swearing a collective oath before undertaking their plan, directly parallels the collective, organized nature of the Anunnaki Council's decision-making already examined in the Mesopotamian material. The transmission of specific advanced technical knowledge, metallurgy in particular, by a named individual teacher figure, Azazel, parallels the culture-bringer role occupied by Oannes, Enki, and Thoth, though inverted here into a distinctly negative and forbidden framing rather than a beneficial one. The production of a hybrid race through direct union between the descended beings and human women parallels, in a considerably more explicit and narratively developed form, the genetic and biological creation themes already examined in the Mesopotamian material regarding the origin of humanity itself, extending the theme from the creation of the human species as a whole to the creation of a specific secondary hybrid population, and the flood itself, understood in the Enochic tradition as a targeted response to this specific genetic and technological corruption, again parallels the Mesopotamian flood narrative's own underlying tension, examined in the earlier sections of this script, between a punitive senior authority determined to eliminate a problem population and a more sympathetic figure who works to preserve a righteous remnant. Genesis 6 and the Book of Enoch are not the only Second Temple period Jewish texts to expand on this material. The Book of Jubilees, another text excluded from the standard Hebrew and Protestant canon, but preserved as canonical scripture within the Ethiopian tradition, and also represented among the Dead Sea Scrolls, retells much of the Genesis narrative with its own additional details regarding the Watchers, describing them as originally sent to Earth specifically to teach humanity righteousness and proper judgment before their subsequent corruption and fall from this original mission. And among the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, fragments of a previously unknown text scholars call the Book of Giants provide additional narrative material focused specifically on the giant offspring of the Watchers, including what appear to be prophetic dreams experienced by these giants, foretelling the coming judgment and destruction awaiting them, fragments that, while too incomplete to reconstruct into a fully continuous narrative, confirm that this entire body of material, the Watchers, their forbidden unions, and their giant offspring, occupied a significant and actively developed place within the broader Jewish religious literature of the centuries immediately preceding and following the turn of the Common Era, considerably more significant than its later, marginalized position within both Jewish and most branches of Christian religious tradition might suggest to a modern reader encountering only the brief canonical account in Genesis. It is worth closing this initial examination of the biblical material with a brief return to the Garden of Eden narrative that immediately precedes Genesis 6 in the canonical text, because it introduces a theme this script has already encountered directly in the Mesopotamian material: the deliberate withholding of immortality from humanity by a controlling divine authority. Genesis describes two specific trees standing at the center of the Garden of Eden: the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, whose fruit humanity is forbidden to eat, and the tree of life, whose fruit, the text states explicitly, would grant eternal life to whoever consumed it. After the first humans eat from the forbidden tree of knowledge, God's stated concern, expressed directly in Genesis 3:22, is not primarily about the transgression of the initial prohibition itself, but about the danger of subsequent access to the second tree. Behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand, and take also of the tree of life, and eat, and live forever. Humanity is subsequently expelled from the garden, and cherubim, along with a flaming turning sword, are stationed specifically to guard the path to the tree of life and prevent any future access to it. This narrative structure, direct textual concern about humanity gaining access to extended or eternal life, followed by decisive and permanent action to physically prevent that access, mirrors with striking precision the Mesopotamian myth of Adapa examined earlier in this script, in which Enki's warning prevents Adapa from accepting the bread and water of eternal life offered by Anu, and it represents one of the clearest and most specific cross-cultural parallels this script will examine, a shared narrative structure appearing in two textual traditions developed in the same general geographic region, but preserved through entirely distinct religious and linguistic transmission over well over 1,000 years. Having established the biblical foundation of the Watcher's narrative and its close structural relationship to the Mesopotamian material already examined, this script turns next to the later prophetic and apocalyptic literature of the Hebrew Bible, where descriptions of divine beings become considerably more visually and mechanically elaborate, culminating in the prophet Ezekiel's celebrated and endlessly debated vision of a wheel within a wheel, and to the broader angelic hierarchy that later Jewish and Christian tradition developed to organize and categorize the full range of celestial beings the biblical and extra-biblical textual tradition describes. The Levant and the Bible too, Ezekiel's wheel, and the angelic hierarchy. No single passage in the entire body of ancient astronaut literature receives more sustained attention than the opening chapter of the book of Ezekiel, and for good reason. It is, among all the texts examined in this script so far, the single most detailed, technical, and mechanically specific description of a divine encounter to survive from the ancient world. Ezekiel, writing from among the Judean exiles in Babylon in the 6th century BCE, describes a vision that begins with a great storm cloud approaching from the north, accompanied by a fire that unfolds continuously and a brightness surrounding it, from the midst of which emerges what the text describes as the likeness of 4 living creatures, each possessing 4 faces: human, lion, ox, and eagle, and 4 wings, with straight legs and feet described as resembling the sole of a calf's foot, gleaming like burnished bronze. Beneath these creatures, Ezekiel describes a wheel upon the earth beside each of the four creatures, and then, in the verse most frequently cited in popular ancient astronaut discourse, states that the appearance of the wheels and their construction resembled a wheel within a wheel, capable of moving in any of four directions without needing to turn, and that the rims of these wheels were so high that they were dreadful and full of eyes round about on all four wheels. Above the heads of the living creatures, Ezekiel describes a firmament, a term used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible to describe the vault or dome of the sky, colored like terrible crystal stretched out above them, and above this firmament, a throne with the appearance of sapphire, upon which sat a figure Ezekiel describes with careful, almost hesitant precision as having the appearance of a man, though composed from the waist up of what looked like glowing amber or burning metal, and from the waist down of what looked like fire, surrounded on all sides by a brightness like a rainbow appearing in a cloud on a rainy day. Ezekiel concludes this description by stating explicitly that this was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord, and that upon seeing it, he fell face down to the ground. This vision is not a brief or passing image within Ezekiel's larger text. It occupies the entire first chapter of the book in careful, sustained, almost obsessively detailed description, and elements of the same throne chariot vision recur later in the book, particularly in chapter 10, where the living creatures are explicitly identified as cherubim. The conventional scholarly interpretation of Ezekiel's vision situates it firmly within the broader genre of ancient Near Eastern throne theophany, the visionary appearance of a deity enthroned in overwhelming, awe-inspiring splendor, a well-documented literary and religious genre with clear parallels in Mesopotamian, Canaanite, and broader ancient Near Eastern religious literature, in which storm imagery, fire, brightness, and complex composite creatures function as conventional symbolic vocabulary for conveying the transcendent, overwhelming nature of divine glory. Imagery scholars argue Ezekiel, as a priest deeply versed in the temple traditions of Jerusalem, would have drawn upon deliberately and skillfully to construct a maximally awe-inspiring visionary account of God's presence, mobile and enthroned, appearing even outside the physical temple in Jerusalem to a prophet in exile in Babylon, a theologically significant point in its own right, since it demonstrated to the exiled community that God's presence and authority were not confined to the destroyed temple, but remained active and available even in a foreign land. This interpretation is well grounded in comparative ancient Near Eastern literature and remains the dominant scholarly position. The alternative, considerably more literal and mechanically oriented interpretation of this passage gained particular prominence through the work of Joseph Blumrich, a NASA engineer who had worked on the Saturn V rocket program and who set out, by his own account, specifically to debunk the ancient astronaut interpretation of Ezekiel's vision, only to conclude, after extensive engineering analysis, that the text described a mechanically coherent and physically plausible flying craft. In his 1974 book, The Spaceships of Ezekiel, Blumrich proposed a detailed technical reconstruction of the vehicle described in the text, interpreting the four living creatures not as literal composite animal-headed beings, but as landing legs or support struts arranged around a central rotating vehicle body, the wheel within a wheel, as a helicopter-like rotor and landing gear assembly capable of movement in multiple directions, the eyes covering the wheel rims as small lights or sensor apertures, and the fire and brightness surrounding the vision as the exhaust and illumination produced by the craft's propulsion system. Blumrich's professional engineering credentials lent his interpretation a degree of technical credibility that distinguished it from much of the broader ancient astronaut literature, and his proposed reconstruction has been reproduced extensively in subsequent popular treatments of this subject. It is important, however, to state clearly that Blumrich's interpretation has not been accepted by biblical scholars, ancient Near Eastern specialists, or the broader engineering and aerospace community as an established or even plausible reading of Ezekiel's actual textual intent, and that his reconstruction requires selectively reinterpreting specific Hebrew terms in ways that depart substantially from their established meaning and from the broader theophanic genre conventions well documented elsewhere in ancient Near Eastern religious literature. Blumrich's technical background made his specific proposal more mechanically detailed and internally consistent than most ancient astronaut readings of ancient texts, but it did not, in the assessment of the relevant academic specialists, make it more textually or historically accurate. Beyond Ezekiel, the broader category of beings this script has been examining under the heading Shining Ones receives further, distinct elaboration in the Hebrew Bible through the categories of cherubim and seraphim, two classes of celestial being frequently conflated in popular imagination, but described with quite distinct characteristics in the biblical text itself. Cherubim, as already noted, appear first in Genesis, stationed to guard the entrance to Eden after the expulsion of the first humans, and reappear repeatedly throughout the Hebrew Bible, most notably as the composite golden figures overshadowing the Ark of the Covenant with their wings, described in exacting architectural detail in the book of Exodus, and again as the towering guardian figures Ezekiel describes flanking the divine throne. Seraphim, by contrast, appear explicitly by name in only a single passage of the Hebrew Bible, in the prophet Isaiah's own throne vision in Isaiah chapter 6, where Isaiah describes seraphim standing above the throne, each possessing 6 wings, 2 covering the face, 2 covering the feet, and 2 used for flight, calling out to one another in the declaration, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts," a passage that would go on to exert enormous influence on later Jewish and Christian liturgy. The Hebrew root of the word seraphim connects to the verb to burn, and most scholars translate the term as burning ones, a description scholars generally connect to imagery of fiery serpents mentioned elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, though the exact original visual conception behind the term remains genuinely debated within biblical scholarship. What is notable for the purposes of this script is that both categories of being, cherubim and seraphim, are consistently associated across their scattered biblical appearances with fire, brightness, and an overwhelming, almost unbearable visual intensity, reinforcing the pattern this script has traced since its opening section. Divine and angelic beings across the ancient Near Eastern textual tradition are persistently and specifically associated with a quality of literal, physical radiance, rather than merely abstract holiness or moral purity. The Book of Daniel, composed in its final form during the 2nd century BCE, though set narratively during the Babylonian exile several centuries earlier, provides additional material relevant to this examination, particularly in its later chapters, which shift from the court narratives of the book's first half into a series of increasingly elaborate apocalyptic visions. Daniel chapter 7 describes a vision of the Ancient of Days, an aged, white-haired figure enthroned amid fire, attended by 10,000 times 10,000 ministering beings, a scene of overwhelming celestial scale and organization. Daniel chapter 10, considerably less frequently discussed than the more famous visions of the book, but genuinely significant for the purposes of this script, describes an angelic messenger, generally identified with the archangel Gabriel, who appears to Daniel and explains a delay of 3 weeks in responding to Daniel's prayers by stating that he had been opposed and detained by a being called the Prince of the Kingdom of Persia until the archangel Michael arrived to assist him, at which point he was finally able to reach Daniel. This passage is theologically significant because it describes what appears to be a direct conflict between angelic beings operating with specific, territorially defined spheres of authority and influence tied to particular human political kingdoms, a concept later Jewish and Christian tradition would develop considerably further, and which some ancient astronaut researchers cite as evidence of ongoing factional conflict among these beings, extending well beyond the earlier Genesis and Enochic material already examined, suggesting a persistent, organized presence with continuing territorial and political interests in human affairs across many centuries, rather than a single, ancient episode of contact confined to the distant mythological past. Over the centuries following the composition of the biblical texts themselves, both Jewish and Christian religious tradition developed increasingly elaborate systems for organizing and classifying the full range of angelic beings referenced across scripture and extra-biblical literature. Within Judaism, the mystical tradition known as Merkabah mysticism, taking its name directly from the Hebrew word for chariot and drawing its primary inspiration from Ezekiel's throne vision, developed during the first several centuries of the Common Era and involved structured, meditative, and visionary practices aimed at achieving direct spiritual ascent through a series of 7 heavenly palaces, encountering increasingly powerful angelic guardians at each stage, culminating in a vision of the divine throne chariot itself. This tradition would later feed directly into the development of Kabbalah, the broader medieval Jewish mystical tradition, which developed its own elaborate cosmological system, including the 10 sephirot, emanations or attributes of divine energy, and detailed hierarchies of angelic beings associated with each. Within Christianity, the most influential systematic organization of the angelic hierarchy was developed by an anonymous author writing in the late 5th or early 6th century under the name Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, whose work, The Celestial Hierarchy, organized angelic beings into 3 triads of 3 ranks each, ranging from the seraphim, cherubim, and thrones closest to the divine presence, through the dominions, virtues, and powers occupying an intermediate position, down to the principalities, archangels, and angels most directly involved in human affairs. It should be stated clearly that this specific 9-fold hierarchical system is a later theological construction, composed roughly a millennium after the biblical texts it draws upon, and represents systematic medieval theological organization rather than an ancient or original biblical framework, though it draws its component categories directly from genuine biblical and extra-biblical terminology already examined in this script. The 4 archangels named across the biblical and extra-biblical Jewish tradition, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, deserve brief individual attention here because each occupies a distinct and recurring functional role across the textual tradition that parallels, in interesting ways, the differentiated roles occupied by individual named Anunnaki and Neteru already examined in this script. Michael consistently appears in a martial, protective role, described in Daniel as the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people, and in later Christian tradition as the commander of the heavenly armies who leads the battle against the rebellious angels in the book of Revelation. Gabriel consistently appears in a messenger role, delivering specific prophetic announcements, most famously the announcement of Jesus' birth in the Christian Gospel of Luke, but already established in this messenger capacity in the book of Daniel centuries earlier. Raphael, whose name means God heals, appears prominently in the deuterocanonical book of Tobit in a healing and guiding capacity, and Uriel, whose name means God is my light or fire of God, appears extensively in the book of Enoch, already examined in the previous section, frequently serving as Enoch's guide through the cosmos and interpreter of the visions Enoch receives. This differentiation of function among named individual angelic beings, each associated with a specific and consistent domain of responsibility, parallels the specialized roles occupied by Enki as engineer and creator, Enlil as executive authority, Thoth as record keeper and knowledge holder, and Osiris as civilizing ruler and later underworld judge, reinforcing once again the broader pattern this script has traced across every civilization examined so far. Divine hierarchies structured not as an undifferentiated mass of interchangeable supernatural power, but as an organized body of distinct individuals with specific names, specific personalities, and specific, consistently maintained areas of responsibility. Having now examined the ancient Near Eastern and Levantine material in considerable depth across 4 full sections of this script, we turn next to a civilization developing along an entirely separate trajectory on the Indian subcontinent, where the ancient Vedic and epic literature preserves what may be the single most technologically explicit body of ancient religious literature anywhere in the world. Detailed accounts of flying vehicles called vimanas, and weapons of such devastating and specifically described power that a considerable body of modern researchers, including some with backgrounds in physics and engineering, have argued these passages preserve genuine ancient memory of advanced aerial and even nuclear-scale weaponry encountered by a civilization many thousands of years before the modern development of comparable technology. Ancient India, the Vimanas and the Astras of the Mahabharata. The religious and epic literature of ancient India presents this investigation with source material of a fundamentally different character than anything examined so far in this script. Where the Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Levantine texts describe divine beings primarily in terms of their appearance, their authority, and their relationships to one another, the Sanskrit epic tradition, and in particular the Mahabharata, the vast epic poem traditionally attributed to the sage Vyasa and generally understood by scholars to have reached something close to its current form between roughly 400 BCE and 400 CE, though drawing on considerably older oral traditions, describes with unusual specificity the vehicles the gods and semi-divine warriors used to travel through the sky, and the weapons they deployed in battle, in language that a considerable number of modern readers, including some with formal training in physics and engineering, have found startlingly evocative of advanced aerospace and weapons technology. The term used throughout Sanskrit literature for these flying vehicles is vimana, a word that in its most basic and earliest usage simply meant a building, palace, or temple structure, and which only gradually, across the development of Sanskrit epic and later Puranic literature, came to carry the specific additional meaning of a flying chariot or aerial vehicle used by gods and, in some accounts, by human kings and sages who had achieved sufficient spiritual attainment or divine favor to be granted the use of one. The Ramayana, India's other great epic, traditionally attributed to the sage Valmiki and generally dated by scholars to a period somewhat earlier than the Mahabharata's final compilation, describes the Pushpaka Vimana in particularly vivid detail, a flying palace originally belonging to Kubera, the god of wealth, later seized by the demon king Ravana, and eventually used by the hero Rama to fly back to his kingdom of Ayodhya following his victory over Ravana. The text describes the Pushpaka Vimana as a vehicle shining like the sun, capable of traveling at the will of its occupant, large enough to comfortably carry Rama, his wife Sita, his brother Lakshmana, and their allies, and moving through the sky with a speed and grace the text repeatedly emphasizes through comparison to the swiftness of thought itself. The Mahabharata contains numerous additional references to Vimanas throughout its extensive narrative, including a particularly detailed account of an aerial city or fortress called Sauba, belonging to a king named Shalva, described as an iron city that moved through the sky at will, capable of becoming invisible, and ultimately destroyed in battle by the hero Krishna using what the text describes as a weapon capable of striking it down from the sky. Beyond the epic narratives themselves, the later Sanskrit technical and architectural text, known as the Samarangana Sutradhara, traditionally attributed to King Bhoja of the 11th century CE, includes a chapter describing the theoretical construction of vimanas, discussing materials, mechanisms, and principles of operation in language that, while considerably more systematic and treatise-like than the narrative epic material, remains couched throughout in terms consistent with the broader Sanskrit literary and philosophical tradition of its actual composition period, roughly 1,000 years after the core Mahabharata narrative had already taken shape, rather than presenting itself as a surviving fragment of a considerably more ancient technical manual. This point regarding dating requires particular care and precision because one specific text, frequently cited in popular ancient astronaut literature as definitive proof of ancient Indian aviation technology, deserves direct and explicit correction here. The text commonly known as the Vaimanika Shastra, sometimes translated as the Science of Aeronautics, which purports to be an ancient Sanskrit manual describing in remarkably technical detail the construction, materials, and operation of vimanas, including specific alloys, engine types, and pilot training regimens, is not, in fact, an ancient text at all. It was produced in the early 20th century, between 1918 and 1923, by a spiritual medium named named Pandit Subbaraya Shastri, who dictated the material claiming to channel it from the ancient sage Bharadwaja, and it was subsequently compiled and published by his student, G. Venkatachala Sharma. When the text was formally studied and translated by a team of aeronautical engineers and Sanskrit scholars at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore in 1974, their detailed technical analysis concluded that the vehicles described in the text were aerodynamically unsound and could not have functioned as described using any coherent set of physical principles, ancient or modern, and that the Sanskrit vocabulary employed throughout the text included terms and grammatical constructions inconsistent with genuinely ancient Sanskrit usage, further supporting an early 20th century origin rather than an ancient one. This script includes this correction explicitly and prominently because the Vaimanika Shastra remains to this day one of the most frequently and uncritically cited pieces of supposed evidence in popular ancient astronaut discourse regarding India, and any serious examination of this subject has an obligation to distinguish clearly between the genuinely ancient epic and Puranic material, which does contain the Vaimana references already discussed, and this considerably later and scientifically discredited 20th century composition, which does not represent authentic ancient source material, regardless of how frequently it continues to be cited as though it does. Turning from vehicles to weapons, the Mahabharata's description of divine and semi-divine weaponry, referred to throughout the text using the term astra, has generated perhaps even more sustained popular fascination than the Vimana material, particularly regarding the weapon known as the Brahmastra, described repeatedly throughout the epic as a weapon of ultimate and near-apocalyptic destructive power, invoked through specific mantras known only to those who had received proper spiritual and martial training from a qualified teacher, and understood within the text's own internal moral framework as a weapon of last resort, never to be used against an inferior or unworthy opponent, and capable, if unleashed without proper restraint, of destroying entire kingdoms and rendering the land where it was used barren for generations. The most frequently cited passage in this context comes from the Mausala Parva, a relatively brief section of the Mahabharata, describing the eventual self-destruction of the Yadava clan, in which the text describes a weapon, sometimes identified in popular discussion with an iron thunderbolt, or in some translations connected to the broader category of astra weaponry, that produces an explosion described as bright as 10,000 suns, reduces bodies to ash so completely that survivors could not identify the dead by their remains, causes hair and nails to fall out, contaminates food and water for an extended period afterward, and forces survivors to immerse themselves repeatedly in rivers to cleanse themselves of the resulting affliction. It is this specific passage and its striking, undeniable resemblance to the documented physical effects of nuclear detonation, radiation sickness, thermal flash injury, and fallout contamination that has generated the most sustained popular speculation regarding ancient Indian weapons technology. Speculation that gained particular momentum following the actual development and use of nuclear weapons in the 20th century, when writers and researchers began reading these ancient passages retrospectively through the lens of newly available and horrifyingly concrete knowledge of what atomic weaponry actually does to human bodies and the surrounding environment. This retrospective reading raises an important methodological question this script has an obligation to address directly. Does the ancient text's resemblance to nuclear weapon effects represent a genuine, independently transmitted ancient memory of some comparable ancient technology, or does it instead represent a case of modern readers newly equipped with vivid and disturbing knowledge of nuclear warfare, projecting that specific modern knowledge backward onto ancient poetic language that was originally intended in a considerably more metaphorical, cosmological, or purely literary register, consistent with the broader Sanskrit epic tradition's frequent use of hyperbolic, cosmic scale imagery to convey the moral and emotional gravity of catastrophic events, imagery found throughout world epic literature without any implication of literal advanced weaponry, including in the destructive battle scenes of the Iliad, the Norse Ragnarok narratives, and numerous other ancient epic traditions that describe world-ending or civilization-ending violence in maximally dramatic terms without any corresponding claim to describe actual historical technology. Mainstream Indologists and Sanskrit scholars overwhelmingly favor this second, literary and cosmological reading, pointing out that the Mahabharata as a whole is saturated throughout with supernatural and cosmically hyperbolic imagery, divine weapons capable of summoning storms, fire, and floods, warriors possessing superhuman strength and endurance, and battles fought with the direct participation of gods and celestial beings, observing and occasionally intervening from the sky. A consistent literary register that scholars argue should be read holistically as epic hyperbole and religious cosmology, rather than selectively mined for individual passages that happen to resemble modern technology, while ignoring the surrounding supernatural framework within which those passages are embedded. Proponents of the ancient nuclear weapons hypothesis, by contrast, argue that the specificity of certain physical details in the Mausala Parva passage, particularly the description of hair and nails falling out and the need for prolonged purification through repeated immersion in water, exceeds what would be necessary for purely poetic or symbolic effect, and represents a level of specific, almost clinical physiological detail that would be difficult for an ancient author to invent without some underlying reference point, whether that reference point was an actual ancient weapon of comparable destructive capacity, or, in a more modest version of this argument, a genuine ancient observation of radiation sickness symptoms following some kind of catastrophic natural or technological event whose precise cause has since been lost to history. A related and even more direct claim connecting ancient India to nuclear weaponry involves the Indus Valley civilization site of Mohenjo-Daro in modern Pakistan, where claims have circulated since at least the 1970s, associated particularly with the Italian researcher David Davenport, that skeletal remains discovered at the site show elevated radiation levels consistent with exposure to a nuclear detonation, and that the site itself shows evidence of vitrification, glass-like fusion of surrounding materials, consistent with extreme sudden heat exposure. These specific claims have been extensively investigated and firmly rejected by the professional archaeological and physical anthropology community working directly on Indus Valley material, who point out that no peer-reviewed radiological testing of Mohenjo-Daro skeletal remains has ever confirmed elevated radiation levels, that the skeletal remains in question show injury patterns and burial contexts fully consistent with ordinary causes of death and subsequent natural decomposition and disturbance rather than mass casualty from a single catastrophic event, and that no credible geological or archaeological evidence of vitrification or nuclear-consistent thermal damage has been documented at the site by any properly conducted scientific survey. This claim, despite its continued wide circulation in popular ancient astronaut media, should be understood as unsupported by the available physical evidence and rejected by the archaeological community with considerably greater confidence and unanimity than the more genuinely open literary and interpretive questions surrounding the Mausala Parva passage discussed above. What this examination of the Indian material demonstrates, taken as a whole, is a body of source literature considerably richer in technologically evocative detail than anything examined in the preceding sections of this script, but also a body of literature where the boundary between genuinely ancient source material and considerably later, sometimes outright fraudulent, supplementary material requires careful and deliberate attention, a distinction this script has tried to draw as clearly as possible between the authentic and ancient Vimana and Astra material preserved in the Mahabharata and Ramayana themselves, and the 20th century Vaimanika Shastra and the unsubstantiated Mohenjo-Daro radiation claims, which do not meet the same standard of genuine antiquity or physical evidentiary support. In the next section of this script, we turn from the technological and martial dimension of Indian mythology to its broader cosmological and theological structure, examining the Devas and Asuras, the two great factions of divine and semi-divine beings whose recurring cosmic conflict, described across the Vedas, the Puranas, and the great epics alike, provides yet another instance of the factional, internally divided pantheon structure this script has now traced consistently across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant, and which appears, in Indian cosmology, in some of the most elaborately developed and philosophically sophisticated form found anywhere in the ancient world. Ancient India, too, the Devas, Asuras, and the war in heaven. Vedic and Puranic Hindu cosmology divides its vast population of celestial beings into two principal factions, the Devas and the Asuras, whose recurring conflict across countless individual episodes scattered throughout the Vedas, the epics, and the later Puranic literature provides what is arguably the most extensively developed and philosophically elaborated account of a divided, factional pantheon found anywhere in the ancient world. What makes this division particularly significant for the purposes of this script is a detail easily overlooked amid the sheer narrative scale of Hindu mythology. The Devas and Asuras are not, in most tellings, separate and unrelated species or creations. They are, according to the genealogies preserved in texts, including the Vishnu Purana, half-siblings, both descended from the sage Kashyapa, but through different mothers, Aditi in the case of the Devas and Diti, or Danu in the case of the Asuras, making their ongoing cosmic conflict, in the most literal sense available within the mythology's own internal logic, a prolonged and often devastating family struggle for supremacy, resources, and control over the three worlds, rather than a straightforward conflict between good and evil forces of entirely separate origin. This structural detail, a single shared point of origin producing two rival factions whose subsequent conflict shapes the cosmic and human order, extends a pattern this script has now traced with increasing clarity across every civilization examined so far. The Enki-Enlil tension within the unified Anunnaki Council, the Horus-Set conflict within the unified Ennead, and the Watchers versus Archangels conflict within the broader unified category of biblical angelic beings. Ancient astronaut researchers point to this recurring structural pattern, one originating group or species subsequently splitting into rival, competing factions with differing agendas toward humanity, as a particularly significant point of cross-cultural convergence, arguing that it would be a considerably more specific and unusual narrative structure for entirely independent cultures to arrive at separately through coincidence alone than a simpler binary opposition between an unrelated force of good and an unrelated force of evil, which appears far more frequently and more explicably across world mythology as a straightforward projection of basic human moral experience. The single most important narrative episode illustrating the Deva-Asura relationship, and one of the most celebrated and frequently depicted episodes in the whole of Hindu mythology, is the Samudra Manthan, the churning of the ocean of milk, recounted with variations across the Bhagavata Purana, the Vishnu Purana, and the Mahabharata itself. According to this narrative, the Devas, weakened by a curse and seeking to restore their strength and secure the elixir of immortality known as Amrita, entered into a temporary alliance with their Asura rivals, recognizing that the immense cooperative effort required to churn the cosmic ocean and extract its hidden treasures could not be accomplished by either faction alone. Using Mount Mandara as a churning rod resting upon the back of Vishnu in his tortoise avatar, Kurma, to prevent the mountain from sinking into the cosmic sea, and using the great serpent Vasuki as a churning rope wrapped around the mountain and pulled alternately by the Devas at one end and the Asuras at the other, the two factions churned the ocean for what the texts describe as an immense span of time, producing in succession a series of treasures and beings, including the wish-fulfilling cow Kamadhenu, the divine physician Dhanvantari, the goddess of fortune Lakshmi, and, critically, a deadly poison called Halahala, potent enough to threaten the destruction of the entire cosmos, which the god Shiva ultimately consumed and held permanently in his throat to prevent it from harming the universe, a sacrifice that turned his throat permanently blue and earned him the epithet Nilakantha, the blue-throated one. Finally, after this extended and increasingly perilous cooperative effort, Dhanvantari emerged from the churned ocean bearing the pot of Amrita, the coveted elixir of immortality itself, and it is at this precise moment, with the shared goal of the entire cooperative undertaking finally achieved, that the alliance between the Devas and Asuras collapses entirely. The Asuras, in most versions of the narrative, attempt to seize the Amrita for themselves immediately upon its appearance, and Vishnu, intervening directly, assumes the form of Mohini, a supremely beautiful enchantress, and through a combination of seduction and deception, distracts the Asuras and distributes the Amrita exclusively to the Devas, ensuring that only the Deva faction achieves immortality, while the Asuras, despite having contributed equally to the immense labor of producing it, are excluded entirely from its benefits, a betrayal that the texts present as the direct and permanent origin of the enduring enmity between the two factions, an enmity that continues to structure the great majority of subsequent Hindu mythological narrative across the Puranic literature. This narrative, examined through the specific interpretive lens this script has applied throughout, presents yet another instance of the immortality denial theme already encountered twice in this script, in the Mesopotamian myth of Adapa and in the biblical Garden of Eden narrative. Here, the withholding is not directed at humanity broadly, but at one specific faction of a divided quasi-divine population, deliberately and deceptively excluded from an achievement they had labored equally to produce by a controlling authority, Vishnu, acting to preserve a strict and permanent hierarchical division between the two factions. Ancient astronaut researchers who examine this narrative frequently propose that it may preserve, in heavily mythologized and cosmically inflated form, a genuine memory of two rival technologically advanced groups engaged in some kind of joint venture, possibly involving genuine biological, medical, or life extension technology represented by the Amrita itself, an undertaking that ultimately collapsed into betrayal and permanent hostile division, a reading that, like comparable interpretations offered throughout this script, remains firmly speculative and unsupported by mainstream Indological scholarship, which continues to read the Samudra Manthan as a richly developed cosmological and theological narrative addressing themes of cooperation, greed, and the ultimately unstable nature of any alliance between fundamentally opposed forces without requiring any assumption of literal historical or technological reference. Indra, king of the Devas and one of the most prominent deities throughout the earliest layer of Vedic literature, the Rig Veda, deserves particular attention in this examination because of the specific and consistent imagery associated with him throughout this oldest stratum of Indian religious literature. Indra is repeatedly described as riding through the sky in a chariot, drawn in various hymns by horses of great speed and power, and wielding the Vajra, a weapon translated variously as thunderbolt or diamond, forged for him by the craftsman god Tvashtar, and used in Indra's most celebrated mythological act, the slaying of the serpent or dragon Vritra, who had been withholding the cosmic waters, and whose destruction, in the Rig Veda's own telling, releases the waters and restores cosmic and agricultural order, a narrative structure with clear typological parallels to the Mesopotamian Marduk-Tiamat conflict examined earlier in this script, and to the broader ancient Near Eastern mythological pattern of a storm or warrior deity defeating a chaos serpent to establish cosmic order. Indra is consistently accompanied throughout Vedic literature by the Maruts, a troupe of storm deities frequently described riding their own golden chariots across the sky in tight, coordinated formation, their movement associated directly with thunder, lightning, and violent windstorms. Imagery that, like the winged disc examined in the Mesopotamian and Egyptian material, ancient astronaut researchers have proposed might represent a garbled memory of coordinated aerial vehicles, though this reading, once again, finds no support within the specialist Vedic scholarship, which reads the Maruts straightforwardly as personified storm phenomena, consistent with their explicit and repeated textual association with thunder, lightning, and rain throughout the Rig Veda's extensive hymnic corpus. One further detail regarding the Deva-Asura terminology deserves specific mention here because it provides a genuinely fascinating and well-documented linguistic bridge to the next civilization this script will examine. In the Vedic Sanskrit of ancient India, Deva refers to the beneficent senior faction of gods, while Asura, though it originally carried a more neutral or even respectful connotation in the very earliest Vedic material associated with lordship and creative power, gradually came to refer specifically to the rival, adversarial faction, roughly comparable to demons in later Hindu usage. In ancient Persia, however, among the closely related Indo-Iranian peoples who shared a common linguistic and religious ancestry with the Vedic Indians before their historical divergence, this exact terminology appears in precisely inverted form. In the Avestan language of ancient Zoroastrian scripture, Ahura, the cognate term to the Sanskrit Asura, refers to the supreme and beneficent deity Ahura Mazda himself, while Daiva, the cognate term to the Sanskrit Deva, refers specifically to the demonic adversarial forces opposed to Ahura Mazda's cosmic order. This precise terminological inversion between two closely related Indo-Iranian religious traditions, the same root words applied to exactly opposite moral categories in each tradition, is well documented and well understood by historical linguists as reflecting a genuine and specific religious schism that occurred among the ancient Indo-Iranian peoples before their eventual separation into the distinct Vedic Indian and Zoroastrian Persian religious traditions, a schism some scholars associate with the specific religious reforms attributed to the Persian prophet Zoroaster himself, who appears to have deliberately inverted the existing shared terminology as part of a broader theological reformation that elevated Ahura Mazda to supreme status while systematically demoting the previously more ambivalent category of devas to purely demonic status. This documented linguistic schism holds genuine significance for the broader argument this script is developing because it represents one of the clearest instances in the entire ancient world of a documented historical process by which a single shared religious and mythological tradition describing what was evidently once understood as a unified category of powerful celestial beings split into two factions with directly opposed moral status as a result of a specific traceable religious and cultural schism among a once unified population. Ancient astronaut researchers point to this well-documented linguistic and religious split as a rare instance where the broader pattern this script has traced through interpretive speculation across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant finds direct, uncontested historical and linguistic confirmation. A single population's understanding of a shared category of powerful, non-human beings genuinely did split into opposed factions as a result of specific historical and religious developments, even if the underlying cause of that original division, whether a genuine ancient factional conflict among the beings themselves, or simply an internal Indo-Iranian religious and political schism among the human worshippers, remains a matter of continued scholarly interpretation rather than settled fact. Having now traced this Deva-Asura conflict through its central Samudra-Manthan narrative and its illuminating linguistic afterlife in ancient Persia, this script turns next directly to Zoroastrianism itself, the religious tradition founded by the prophet Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, in ancient Persia, a tradition notable among all those examined in this script for its unusually direct and systematic theological association between divinity and literal physical fire and light, and for its detailed cosmology of the Amesha Spentas, the bounteous immortals who surround Ahura Mazda in a structured celestial hierarchy that would go on to exert considerable influence on the later development of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic angelology already examined in the preceding sections of this script. Persia and Zoroaster, Ahura Mazda, and the Amesha Spentas. Zoroastrianism occupies a unique position within this survey, distinct from every tradition examined so far, because it presents itself from its very foundation not as a further elaboration of an existing polytheistic system, but as a deliberate, and in the context of the ancient world, genuinely radical theological reform associated with a specific named historical prophet, Zoroaster, known in his own Avestan language as Zarathustra. The precise dating of Zoroaster's life remains one of the more contested questions in the study of ancient Persian religion, with proposals ranging from as early as 1500 BCE, based on linguistic analysis of the archaic Old Avestan dialect in which the oldest Zoroastrian scriptures are composed, to as late as the 7th or 6th century BCE, closer to the traditional dating preserved in later Zoroastrian and Greek sources. Regardless of the precise date, the core scriptural material most confidently attributed to Zoroaster himself, a collection of 17 hymns known as the Gathas, preserved within the larger Zoroastrian scripture called the Avesta, presents a religious vision centered on the supreme god Ahura Mazda, whose name translates roughly as Wise Lord, locked in an ongoing cosmic struggle against a destructive opposing spirit, variously named Angra Mainyu, or in later Middle Persian sources, Ahriman. What distinguishes Zoroastrian cosmology most sharply from the traditions examined earlier in this script is its systematic and philosophically developed dualism, a framework in which the universe is understood as the battleground for an ongoing cosmic contest between the forces of truth, order, and light, associated with Ahura Mazda, and the forces of deception, chaos, and darkness, associated with Angra Mainyu, a contest in which every individual human being is understood to bear direct moral responsibility for choosing, through their thoughts, words, and deeds, which side of this cosmic struggle they will support. This ethical dualism, considerably more systematically developed than the more loosely structured factional conflicts examined in the preceding sections of this script, would go on to exert profound and well-documented influence on the subsequent development of Jewish apocalyptic literature, and through it, on Christian and Islamic theology, particularly regarding the increasingly sharp cosmic distinction between good and evil forces, and the doctrine of a final eschatological battle and judgment. Themes that become considerably more prominent in Jewish literature composed during and after the period of Persian imperial rule over Judea, following Cyrus the Great's conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE, a period of direct and sustained cultural contact between Persian Zoroastrian religious thought and the Jewish exile community that most scholars of comparative religion regard as historically significant for understanding the subsequent development of Jewish angelology and eschatology already examined in the preceding sections of this script. Central to Zoroastrian cosmology, and directly relevant to the broader pattern this script has traced across every civilization examined so far, are the Amesha Spentas, generally translated as the Bounteous Immortals, a group of 7 divine beings, including Ahura Mazda himself in some formulations, or 6 subordinate beings surrounding Ahura Mazda in others, each associated with a specific aspect of creation and a specific abstract ethical or spiritual quality. Vohu Mana, good mind, is associated with cattle and with humanity's capacity for wise judgment. Asha Vahishta, best truth or best righteousness, is associated with fire and with the fundamental cosmic principle of order and truth that stands in direct opposition to falsehood and chaos. Kshatra Vairya, desirable dominion, is associated with metal and with the establishment of righteous authority and governance. Spenta Armaiti, bounteous devotion, is associated with the earth itself and with humble, faithful devotion. Haurvatat, wholeness or health, is associated with water, and Amaritat, immortality, is associated with plants. With these final 2 Amesha Spentas frequently paired together throughout Zoroastrian scripture as representing the ultimate reward of spiritual and physical completeness available to those who follow the path of Asha, righteous truth. This systematic structure, 7 divine beings, each governing a specific domain of creation and a specific corresponding ethical principle, represents one of the most philosophically organized and abstractly developed divine hierarchies examined anywhere in this script, considerably more systematic in its underlying logical structure than the more narratively driven pantheons of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and even Vedic India. Fire holds a position of unique and central importance within Zoroastrian religious practice, a position that connects directly to the broader theme of literal, physical radiance associated with divinity that this script has traced consistently since its opening section. Zoroastrian fire temples, some of which maintain flames that religious tradition holds, have burned continuously for well over 1,000 years. House a sacred fire, understood not as a mere symbol of Ahura Mazda, but as a direct physical manifestation of Asha, righteous truth, and cosmic order, tended continuously by specially trained priests who maintain ritual purity and feed the flame according to precise and carefully preserved ceremonial procedure. The Avestan term Atar, personifying sacred fire, appears throughout Zoroastrian scripture as a divine being in its own right, sometimes described as the son of Ahura Mazda, and Zoroastrian religious practice throughout its documented history has consistently oriented itself, whether in formal fire temples or in the direction of the sun and other sources of natural light when a temple fire is unavailable, toward physical, visible sources of light and flame as the most direct available access point to divine presence, a practice that has led to Zoroastrians being described, somewhat inaccurately according to Zoroastrian theologians themselves, as fire worshippers, when the more precise theological position holds that fire is honored specifically as a symbol and physical manifestation of divine truth and presence, rather than as an object of worship in its own right. Beyond the seven Amisha Spentas, Zoroastrian cosmology includes a broader category of lesser divine beings called Yazatas, those worthy of worship, among whom Mithra occupies a position of particular historical significance, extending well beyond ancient Persia itself. Mithra is described throughout the Avesta as the guardian of covenants and contracts, an all-seeing deity associated with the sun and with the enforcement of truthful dealing between individuals, watching over human affairs with 1,000 ears and 10,000 eyes, according to the elaborate hymnic praise preserved in the Avestan Mir Yasht. Mithra's cult subsequently spread far beyond Persia itself, becoming, in a considerably transformed Hellenized and later Romanized form, one of the most widespread and influential mystery religions of the Roman Empire, with dedicated underground temples called Mithraea, discovered across the full extent of Roman territory from Britain to the eastern Mediterranean, their walls decorated with the recurring central image of Mithras in the act of slaying a great bull, an image whose precise theological meaning within Roman Mithraism remains debated among scholars, but which demonstrates, at minimum, the genuine and substantial historical reach of this originally Persian solar deity across an enormous span of geography and time, offering a well-documented, historically confirmed instance of religious transmission across cultures that stands in useful methodological contrast to the more speculative instances of possible independent parallel development this script has examined in connection with other civilizations. The visual symbol most closely associated with Zoroastrianism, and one that holds particular significance for the broader argument of this script, is the Faravahar, a winged disc symbol featuring a bearded human figure emerging from its center, one hand typically raised, depicted extensively on the monumental architecture of the ancient Persian Achaemenid Empire, including prominently at the royal complex of Persepolis. The strong visual resemblance between the Faravahar and the Egyptian and Mesopotamian winged disc symbols examined earlier in this script has not gone unnoticed by scholars of ancient Near Eastern iconography, and the connection is, in this particular case, considerably less speculative than in the Egyptian and Mesopotamian instances discussed previously, because a well-documented and continuous chain of artistic and religious influence connects Assyrian and Egyptian winged disc imagery directly to its later Persian adaptation, reflecting the substantial cultural and political influence Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilization exercised over the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which had absorbed both Mesopotamia and, for a period, Egypt itself, into its imperial territory. The specific meaning of the Faravahar within Zoroastrian tradition itself remains debated even among Zoroastrian scholars and practitioners, with some identifying the central figure as a representation of the Fravashi, a guardian spirit believed in Zoroastrian theology to exist for every individual soul both before birth and after death, others connecting it more directly to the concept of Kvarana or Far, a term referring to a kind of divine glory or radiant fortune believed to attach itself to legitimate and divinely favored rulers, a concept that itself reinforces, once again, the persistent ancient association between legitimate divine or royal authority and literal, visible radiance that this script has traced across every single civilization examined thus far. Ancient astronaut researchers, applying the same interpretive framework used for the Egyptian and Mesopotamian winged disk, proposed that the Faravahar's consistent visual structure, again suggesting the outline of a vehicle viewed from a particular angle, might represent a further stylized descendant of an original, literal representation of an aerial craft. Though, as with the earlier instances of this argument, this reading finds no support among the historians of ancient Near Eastern art and iconography who have studied the documented development of this specific symbolic tradition. Zoroastrian eschatology, the tradition's teaching regarding the ultimate future fate of the cosmos, deserves attention in this examination because of its considerable and well-documented influence on subsequent Jewish, Christian, and Islamic eschatological thought. Zoroastrian scripture teaches that history moves toward an ultimate culmination called the Freshokareta, a final renewal and restoration of the entire created world, in which the forces of Ahura Mazda achieve final and permanent victory over Angra Mainyu. All the dead are resurrected and undergo a final judgment involving passage through a river of molten metal that burns only the wicked while feeling like warm milk to the righteous, and the cosmos is restored to a state of perfect and permanent goodness, free from death, disease, and suffering. Central to this eschatological narrative is the figure of the Saoshyant, a future savior prophesied to be born of a virgin who conceives after bathing in a lake where Zoroaster's preserved seed is miraculously maintained, who will lead the final resurrection and renewal of the world. This narrative structure, a miraculously conceived savior figure, born of a virgin mother, whose arrival inaugurates the final resurrection of the dead and the ultimate restoration of cosmic order, bears an obvious and frequently noted structural resemblance to later Christian eschatology and messianic expectation, and the majority of scholars specializing in comparative ancient Near Eastern and Persian religion regard this resemblance as reflecting genuine historical influence, transmitted through the extended period of Persian imperial rule over Judea, and the broader cultural exchange this period facilitated rather than coincidental independent development, offering a further well-documented, historically grounded instance of cross-cultural religious transmission that stands alongside the Mithraic material already discussed as a useful methodological anchor point within a broader survey that otherwise deals extensively with more speculative and contested claims of independent parallel development. Having now examined Zoroastrian Persia's distinctively systematic and philosophically developed theology of light, fire, and cosmic dualism, this script turns next to ancient Greece, where a pantheon considerably more familiar to most contemporary viewers awaits examination, and where the myth of Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, provides one of the most direct and explicitly framed culture-bringer narratives examined anywhere in this entire survey, a narrative whose central act of forbidden technological transmission from a divine to a human sphere, and whose central figure's subsequent and horrifically specific punishment for that act, will complete the pattern of teacher, transgression, and consequence this script has now traced with remarkable consistency from Sumer through Persia. Greece, the Olympians, Prometheus, and the theft of fire. Greek mythology, as systematized primarily through the poet Hesiod's Theogony, composed around the 8th century BCE and representing one of the earliest attempts anywhere in the ancient world to organize an inherited body of oral mythological tradition into a single coherent genealogical and cosmological narrative, opens with a succession of divine generations whose structure will, by this point in the script, feel immediately and thoroughly familiar. From primordial chaos emerges Gaia, the earth, who produces Uranus, the sky, and their union produces the Titans, a generation of powerful primordial deities, among whom Cronus, at his mother, Gaia's urging and using a sickle she provides him, castrates and overthrows his father Uranus, whose spilled blood, falling upon the earth, gives rise to a race of giants, and whose severed genitals, cast into the sea, generate the foam from which Aphrodite herself is born. Cronus subsequently rules over the cosmos, alongside his sister wife, Rhea, but fearing a prophecy that he will in turn be overthrown by one of his own children, Cronus swallows each of his offspring immediately after their birth, until Rhea, determined to save her youngest son, deceives Cronus with a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes and hides the infant Zeus away, to be raised in secret on the island of Crete. Zeus, upon reaching maturity, returns to confront his father, forces Cronus to disgorge his previously swallowed siblings, and leads this newly freed generation of gods, who will become the Olympians, in a prolonged cosmic war against Cronus and the majority of the Titans, called the Titanomachy, a conflict Zeus and his siblings ultimately win, imprisoning the defeated Titans in Tartarus, the deepest region of the underworld, and establishing the Olympian order that governs the classical Greek pantheon familiar to most modern audiences. This structure of successive divine generations, each overthrowing its predecessor through violence, castration, or forced consumption and subsequent regurgitation, closely parallels the Mesopotamian Enuma Elish's account of successive divine generations culminating in Marduk's violent overthrow of the primordial Tiamat, and the Egyptian Ennead's own genealogical succession from Adam through Shu, Tefnut, Geb, and Nut, though the Greek material develops this succession theme with considerably more graphic violence and psychological drama than either of the earlier traditions this script has examined. Scholars of comparative Indo-European mythology, including notably the 20th century scholar Georges Dumézil and his successors, have documented extensive structural parallels between Greek, Vedic Indian, and other Indo-European mythological traditions, tracing many of these shared narrative patterns to a common inherited mythological framework carried by the ancestral Proto-Indo-European speaking populations before their historical dispersal across Europe and Asia, a well-established scholarly framework that offers a considerably more historically and linguistically grounded explanation for many Greek-Vedic parallels than the independent contact hypothesis this script has been examining throughout, though it should be noted that this Indo-European inheritance model does not, on its own, adequately account for parallels between the Indo-European traditions and the entirely unrelated linguistic families represented by Sumerian, Egyptian, and the Semitic Hebrew tradition, parallels that remain considerably harder to explain through shared linguistic inheritance alone. The figure of Prometheus occupies a position within Greek mythology that will, by this point in the script, require little introduction to establish its relevance. A Titan by birth, though one who sided with Zeus during the Titanomachy and was therefore spared imprisonment in Tartarus alongside the majority of his fellow Titans, Prometheus is credited across multiple Greek sources, including Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days, and, considerably more elaborately, in the tragedian Aeschylus's play Prometheus Bound, with the creation of humanity itself, molding the first humans from clay, and subsequently, and far more consequentially, for the mythology's ongoing narrative, with the theft of fire from the gods on humanity's behalf. According to the most commonly preserved version of this narrative, Zeus, angered by an earlier deception Prometheus had perpetrated regarding the proper division of sacrificial offerings between gods and mortals, withheld fire from humanity, leaving the newly created human race cold, vulnerable, and unable to develop the technologies, cooking, metalworking, and countless other applications that depend directly on controlled access to fire. Prometheus, in direct defiance of Zeus's explicit will, stole a hidden ember of fire concealed within the hollow stalk of a giant fennel plant and delivered it to humanity, an act of technological transmission that Aeschylus's tragedy frames explicitly and repeatedly as accompanied by the broader gift of all the practical arts and sciences. Astronomy, mathematics, writing, medicine, metallurgy, navigation, and prophecy, positioning Prometheus in this fullest surviving literary treatment of his myth, not merely as the specific bringer of fire, but as the comprehensive culture bringer figure this script has now encountered under many different names across every civilization examined so far, directly comparable to Oannes in Mesopotamia, Thoth in Egypt, and in a more morally ambivalent register, Azazel among the biblical watchers. Zeus's punishment of Prometheus for this act of forbidden technological transmission is described with harrowing specificity across the surviving Greek sources. Prometheus is bound with unbreakable chains to a remote mountain, traditionally identified with the Caucasus Range, and an eagle, sent by Zeus, descends daily to devour his liver, an organ the ancient Greeks correctly understood to possess a unique capacity for regeneration, ensuring that Prometheus's liver regrows each night only to be devoured again the following day, condemning him to an eternity of repeated torment, a punishment from which he is eventually freed only through the intervention of the hero Heracles, who slays the eagle and breaks Prometheus's chains, an act that occurs, in most versions of the broader mythological chronology, many generations after the original punishment was first inflicted. This specific and extraordinarily severe punishment for the specific act of transmitting forbidden technical knowledge to humanity provides one of the clearest and most explicitly developed parallels this script has yet examined to the Book of Enoch's treatment of the Watchers, and particularly of Azazel, bound and imprisoned specifically for teaching humanity metallurgy and related forbidden technologies, a parallel that becomes considerably more striking when we recall that both narratives, the Greek and the Hebrew, though developed within entirely separate linguistic and cultural traditions, converge on the same fundamental narrative structure. A member of an older, more powerful divine generation defies the explicit will of the ruling authority to transmit specific advanced technical knowledge to humanity and suffers severe, prolonged, and specifically punitive consequences as a direct result. Zeus's response to Prometheus's theft was not limited to Prometheus's own punishment. According to Hesiod's account in both the Theogony and Works and Days, Zeus additionally commissioned the creation of Pandora, the first human woman in the Hesiodic tradition, crafted by the god Hephaestus from earth and water, and endowed with gifts from each of the Olympian gods, sent to earth bearing a sealed jar, frequently mistranslated in later tradition as a box, which she is instructed never to open. When Pandora's curiosity ultimately overcomes this instruction, she releases from the jar a host of afflictions, disease, toil, old age, and countless other sorrows, which spread throughout the world and permanently end the previously carefree existence humanity had enjoyed, with only hope remaining trapped inside the jar as Pandora hastily reseals it. This narrative, positioning the introduction of suffering and hardship into the human condition as a direct and deliberate divine response to Prometheus's earlier act of forbidden technological transmission, bears an obvious structural resemblance to the Genesis narrative of the fall, in which humanity's expulsion from Eden and the introduction of suffering, toil, and mortality into the human condition likewise follows directly from an act of forbidden knowledge acquisition, in that case the eating of fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, reinforcing yet again the cross-cultural pattern this script has traced consistently. Forbidden knowledge or technology transmitted to or acquired by humanity against the explicit will of a controlling divine authority, followed by severe and lasting punitive consequences imposed on humanity, the transmitting figure, or both. The Greek tradition preserves its own account of giants, distinct from, but occasionally conflated with the Titans in later and less careful usage, born, as noted earlier, from the blood of Uranus's castration falling upon the earth, and featured prominently in their own cosmic conflict against the Olympian gods known as the Gigantomachy, depicted extensively in Greek art, most famously on the Pergamon altar's monumental frieze, and recounted in various literary sources as a war the Olympians could only win with the direct assistance of a mortal hero, Heracles, since prophecy held that the giants could not be defeated by gods alone. This detail, the necessity of direct mortal participation in a fundamentally divine conflict, provides an interesting variation on the broader theme of divine-mortal interaction this script has traced throughout. And the giants themselves, as already noted in the earlier examination of the biblical Nephilim, were directly identified by the translators of the Greek Septuagint with the Hebrew Nephilim, using the same Greek term, gigantes, to render both concepts, an identification that demonstrates, at minimum, that ancient Hellenistic Jewish translators themselves perceived a genuine conceptual equivalence between the biblical giant offspring of the Watchers and the Greek mythological giants, offering a documented instance of ancient cross-cultural conceptual translation between these two specific mythological traditions. Hesiod's Works and Days preserves one further element of Greek mythology worth including in this examination, the myth of the 5 ages, describing a sequence of successive human races, each declining in virtue and increasing in hardship from the one before, beginning with a golden age, during which humanity lived under the rule of Cronus in a state of complete ease, abundance, and freedom from labor, sickness, and old age, followed by successively degraded silver, bronze, and heroic ages, the last representing the generation of demigod heroes who fought at Troy and Thebes, before concluding with the Iron Age, Hesiod's own present era, characterized by toil, injustice, and moral decay, with Hesiod expressing the pessimistic expectation that this decline would only continue further before some final catastrophic resolution. This pattern of cyclical or progressive decline from an original golden age of ease and divine proximity toward an increasingly degraded present era bears a striking structural resemblance to the Hindu doctrine of the 4 yugas examined in the preceding sections of this script, descending from the virtuous Satya Yuga through the Treta and Dvapara Yugas to the present, degraded Kali Yuga. And this shared pattern of civilizational and moral decline from an original golden age represents one of the most widespread and consistently recurring structural motifs in world mythology, appearing in some form across nearly every ancient culture this script will examine, and forming a central pillar of the broader ancient astronaut argument that humanity's earliest recorded memory, across nearly every independent cultural tradition, describes not gradual technological and civilizational progress from a primitive original state, but rather decline from a considerably more advanced, ordered, and divinely proximate original condition. One final Greek narrative deserves brief mention before this examination moves onward: the myth of Daedalus and Icarus, the skilled craftsman and his son who, imprisoned on the island of Crete, construct wings from feathers and wax to escape by flight, with Icarus, ignoring his father's specific warning, flying too close to the sun, melting the wax holding his wings together, and plunging to his death in the sea below. This myth, distinct from the divine flight already examined in connection with vimanas and winged discs, in that it describes specifically human, technologically constructed flight rather than inherent divine capability, nonetheless reinforces the broader theme of forbidden or dangerous technology, flight in this instance, whose misuse or overreach carries severe and often fatal consequences, a theme that recurs in one form or another across nearly every civilization examined in this script, and which some researchers interpret as a further cultural memory of genuine ancient aviation technology, however limited or specialized, whose use was understood even in antiquity as carrying inherent danger and requiring careful, disciplined application. Having now traced the Greek material through its succession myths, its Promethean culture-bringer narrative, and its own account of civilizational decline from an original golden age, this script turns next away from the Old World entirely, crossing the Atlantic to examine the mythological traditions of ancient Mesoamerica and the Andes, where the figures of Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha, bearded, pale-skinned culture-bringers arriving from across the sea or descending directly from the heavens, present this investigation with what many researchers consider some of the most striking and geographically isolated parallels to the Old World material already examined, parallels whose explanation, given the near-total absence of any documented contact between the Old and New Worlds prior to the late 15th century, poses a particularly sharp version of the central interpretive question this script has been developing since its opening section. Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, and the bearded sky teachers. The mythological traditions of ancient Mesoamerica and the Andes present this investigation with a genuinely distinct evidentiary situation from everything examined in the preceding sections of this script. Unlike the Old World civilizations already surveyed, which maintained documented trade routes, migration patterns, and cultural exchange across the connected landmass of Africa, Europe, and Asia throughout the entire span of recorded history, the civilizations of the Americas developed in near-total isolation from the Old World for the vast majority of their history, separated by 2 oceans, with no credible archaeological or genetic evidence of sustained contact prior to the Norse settlement of Newfoundland around 1000 CE. itself a brief and geographically limited episode, and the far more consequential and destructive European contact, beginning with Columbus's voyages at the very end of the 15th century. This isolation makes any genuine structural parallel between Old World and New World mythology considerably more difficult to explain through the diffusionist mechanisms, gradual transmission of ideas along documented trade and migration routes that mainstream scholars frequently invoke to explain parallels among the Old World traditions examined earlier in this script. And it is precisely this heightened difficulty of explanation that leads ancient astronaut researchers to treat the Mesoamerican and Andean material as some of the strongest evidence available for their broader hypothesis. Before examining this material directly, however, a significant methodological caution must be stated clearly and given full weight, because it bears directly and specifically on the most famous and most frequently cited figure in this entire section, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity of central Mexico. A considerable body of popular literature, dating back to accounts compiled by Spanish chroniclers in the decades immediately following the conquest of the Aztec Empire, describes Quetzalcoatl as a pale-skinned, bearded figure who arrived in ancient times, taught the peoples of Mesoamerica agriculture, the calendar, metallurgy, and moral law, forbade human sacrifice, and eventually departed eastward across the sea on a raft of serpents, promising to return at a future date associated with a specific calendrical cycle. This narrative gained enormous additional significance in popular history because of a further claim, also present in early colonial-era accounts, that the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II initially believed the arriving Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés might be Quetzalcoatl himself, or a representative of his return, a belief supposedly contributing to the initially cautious and accommodating Aztec response to the Spanish invasion. However, a substantial body of more recent historical scholarship, including detailed work by the historian Matthew Restall, has raised serious and well-documented concerns that this specific returning god narrative, in the particular form connecting it directly to Cortés's arrival, may represent a post-conquest narrative construction developed and elaborated by Spanish chroniclers and their indigenous informants working under Spanish influence in the years following the conquest, potentially serving the retrospective political purpose of framing the conquest as a fulfillment of prophecy and thereby legitimizing Spanish rule, rather than representing an authentic and unaltered pre-conquest Aztec belief. This script includes this important historiographical caution explicitly and prominently, because any responsible examination of this material has an obligation to distinguish, as carefully as the surviving evidence allows, between genuinely pre-conquest indigenous religious tradition regarding Quetzalcoatl and later colonial-era elaboration or reinterpretation of that tradition, a distinction the earliest popular ancient astronaut literature on this subject frequently failed to draw with sufficient care. With this caution firmly established, the genuinely pre-conquest material regarding Quetzalcoatl, preserved in surviving Aztec, Toltec, and earlier Mesoamerican iconography, and in the portions of colonial-era chronicles that scholars regard as most reliably reflecting authentic indigenous tradition, remains substantial and worth examining in its own right. Quetzalcoatl, whose name combines the Nahuatl words for the resplendent Quetzal bird and for serpent, appears in Mesoamerican religious iconography stretching back well before the Aztec period itself, with clear precursor figures identifiable in the art of Teotihuacan, the enormous pre-Aztec metropolis whose ruins, including the massive pyramid of the feathered serpent, indicate that veneration of this deity extends back at least to the early centuries of the Common Era, and quite possibly considerably earlier. Quetzalcoatl was consistently associated across Mesoamerican tradition with wind, with the planet Venus in its role as morning star, with learning and the priesthood, and with the invention of the calendar and the arts of writing, positioning him firmly within the same culture bringer category already established through Oannes, Thoth, and Prometheus in the preceding sections of this script. The Aztec creation narrative credits Quetzalcoatl, working alongside his brother and frequent rival Tezcatlipoca, with the creation of the current world age following the destruction of 4 previous ages, each ending in catastrophe and in one particularly significant episode with descending into the underworld, Mictlan, to retrieve the bones of humanity from previous ages, which he then grinds into powder and mixes with his own blood, drawn through self-inflicted piercing of his own body, to create the current human race, a creation narrative that, once again, involves the direct combination of an existing physical or biological substrate, in this case bones rather than clay, with the blood or essence of a divine being, reinforcing, yet again, the specific creation through combination pattern this script has now traced from Mesopotamia through Egypt and now into an entirely separate hemisphere. The Maya civilization, developing its own sophisticated religious and calendrical tradition in the Yucatan Peninsula and surrounding regions largely independently of central Mexican influence during its classic period, though with considerable later interaction, venerated a closely related feathered serpent deity called Kukulkan, whose stepped pyramid temple at Chichen Itza remains famous for the precisely engineered solar alignment that causes a serpent-shaped shadow to appear to descend the pyramid staircase during the spring and autumn equinoxes, a genuine and well-documented feat of ancient astronomical and architectural precision, regardless of how one interprets the broader Kukulkan mythology associated with the site. The Quiché Maya of the Guatemalan highlands preserved their own detailed creation narrative in the Popol Vuh, a text compiled in written form during the colonial period but understood by scholars to preserve genuinely ancient pre-conquest oral tradition, describing a deity called Guchumats, directly cognate with Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan, and recounting a creation narrative strikingly relevant to the broader pattern this script has traced throughout. The gods, described in the Popol Vuh as the heart of sky and the heart of earth working in council together, attempt to create suitable worshippers capable of properly honoring and sustaining them through several successive failed efforts, first fashioning beings from mud, who prove too weak and unable to speak coherently and are dissolved back into the earth, then fashioning beings from wood, who prove soulless, lacking proper memory of their creators, and are ultimately destroyed in a great flood and by the rebellion of their own household objects and animals, before the gods finally succeed in the narrative's climactic creation episode in fashioning the first true humans from maize dough mixed with water, producing beings capable of proper speech, thought, and worship. This repeated pattern of creation, failure, and renewed attempt using progressively refined methods and materials directly parallels the multiple iterative attempts at human creation already examined in the Mesopotamian material earlier in this script, where Ninhursag's early creative efforts likewise produce a series of flawed or defective beings before a viable template is finally achieved, a parallel developed entirely independently within an unrelated linguistic and cultural tradition separated from Mesopotamia by an entire ocean and several thousand years. The Andean civilizations of South America, centered on the Inca Empire and its predecessor cultures in the highlands of modern Peru and Bolivia, preserved their own distinct but structurally comparable creator deity in the figure of Viracocha, whose full ceremonial name and associated titles, recorded by early Spanish chroniclers working directly with Inca informants, identify him as the ultimate creator of the sun, moon, stars, and all living things. According to the Inca creation narrative, Viracocha emerged from the waters of Lake Titicaca, the immense high-altitude lake straddling the modern border between Peru and Bolivia, in a time of primordial darkness, and there created a first race of giant stone beings who displeased him through their disobedience and were subsequently destroyed in a great flood, closely paralleling the flood-following giant creation pattern already examined extensively in the biblical and broader Near Eastern material earlier in this script. Following this destruction, Viracocha created a second proper race of humans from stone at the ancient site of Tiwanaku, located near the southern shore of Lake Titicaca, and associated with some of the most sophisticated megalithic architecture found anywhere in the ancient Americas, including the famous Gateway of the Sun, a single massive stone archway carved with an elaborate central figure, widely identified by archaeologists as representing Viracocha himself, surrounded by rows of smaller winged figures, generally interpreted as attendant messengers or lesser divine beings. According to the narrative preserved by Spanish chroniclers, Viracocha then dispersed this newly created human population across the earth, sending them out from Tiwanaku to populate the various regions of the Andean world before himself departing, walking across the surface of the Pacific Ocean, according to most versions of the narrative moving toward the west, though some regional variants describe his final departure differently, with a promise, once again echoing the Quetzalcoatl narrative already examined, of an eventual return. The site of Tiwanaku itself deserves further specific attention here because its monumental stonework, involving precisely cut and fitted megalithic blocks weighing many tons each, transported from quarries located a considerable distance from the site itself and assembled using construction techniques that continue to generate genuine scholarly debate regarding the precise methods available to the ancient Andean civilization responsible for its construction, has become one of the most frequently cited sites in popular ancient astronaut literature discussing supposedly anomalous ancient engineering. Mainstream archaeologists studying Tiwanaku have documented substantial evidence of sophisticated but entirely human-scale engineering techniques employed at the site, including quarrying marks, transportation sledges, and evidence of a large organized labor force operating under a developed state-level political organization capable of mobilizing and coordinating the kind of sustained collective effort large-scale megalithic construction requires, evidence that provides a well-documented conventional explanation for the site's construction without requiring recourse to advanced or non-human technological assistance. Though the precise logistics of certain specific engineering challenges at the site, including the transportation of the largest individual stone blocks, remain subjects of genuine ongoing scholarly research and, in certain specific technical details, continued debate. Beyond Mexico and Peru, comparable bearded, teaching sky deity figures appear across a considerable further range of indigenous American traditions, including Bochica, venerated by the Muisca people of the Colombian highlands as a bearded, staff-bearing figure who arrived from the east, taught agriculture, weaving, and moral law, and, in a detail directly paralleling the flood-related destruction already examined in connection with Viracocha, is credited with using his golden staff to strike open a gorge in the earth, draining a catastrophic flood that had previously threatened to destroy the Muisca people entirely, an act that created the spectacular Tequendama Falls, a real and still existing geological feature the Muisca people themselves connected directly to this specific mythological narrative. This recurring combination of specific narrative elements, a teaching figure of unusual, often explicitly noted physical distinctiveness relative to the local population, arriving from a specific cardinal direction, credited with the foundational transmission of agriculture, law, and calendrical knowledge, frequently associated with flood mythology, either as a survivor, a cause of the flood's ending, or both, and typically departing with an explicit promise of future return, recurs with a consistency across these geographically dispersed and, so far as current archaeological and genetic evidence indicates, culturally independent New World traditions that mirrors, in remarkably close structural detail, the culture bringer pattern already traced across the entirely separate and equally isolated Old World traditions examined earlier in this script. The interpretive stakes of this particular section of material are therefore considerably higher than in the preceding sections, precisely because the mainstream diffusionist explanation available for Old World parallels gradual transmission along documented trade and migration routes connecting the civilizations of Africa, Europe, and Asia is simply unavailable here, given the well-documented isolation of the pre-Columbian Americas from the Old World, across the vast majority of their independent civilizational development. Mainstream anthropologists and comparative mythologists respond to this challenge not by abandoning naturalistic explanation, but by pointing to the same underlying psychological and sociological mechanisms already invoked to explain old-world parallels: the universal human tendency to personify and narratively organize the transition from a presumed primitive original state to organized agricultural civilization, the near-universal human experience of catastrophic regional flooding as a genuine and recurring natural phenomenon across nearly every inhabited region of the Earth, and the specific, well-documented tendency of culture-bringer narratives to naturally emphasize a teaching figure's physical distinctiveness from the community receiving the teaching, since a figure perceived as fundamentally similar to the existing population would carry less inherent narrative authority to introduce genuinely novel and transformative knowledge. Ancient astronaut researchers, while acknowledging the genuine force of these psychological and sociological explanations in isolation, argue that their cumulative and repeated convergence across so many independent traditions on this same specific cluster of narrative details still exceeds what pure coincidental convergence alone would be expected to produce, and continues to point towards some form of shared underlying historical experience, whether encountered independently by multiple isolated human populations or, in the strongest version of the hypothesis, genuinely transmitted by the same non-human visitors to multiple isolated regions of the ancient world. Having now completed this examination of the Americas, this script turns next across the Pacific and back into the heart of Asia to examine the distinctive religious and cosmological traditions of ancient China, where the concept of the mandate of heaven, the elaborate bureaucratic organization of the Chinese celestial pantheon, and the figure of the Yellow Emperor, credited with the foundational transmission of Chinese civilization's core technologies and institutions, will complete this script's civilization by civilization survey before turning to a more focused, comparative examination of the specific recurring motifs: the global flood, the language of light, and the physical evidence of ancient megalithic engineering that have now surfaced repeatedly across every single tradition this script has examined. China and East Asia, the celestial bureaucracy, and the Yellow Emperor. Ancient Chinese cosmology developed a religious and political concept unlike anything examined so far in this script: the mandate of heaven, Chen Ming, the belief that legitimate earthly rule was granted directly by heaven, Tian, an impersonal but morally responsive cosmic authority, and could be withdrawn from a dynasty that governed unjustly, a doctrine first articulated to justify the Zhou dynasty's overthrow of the Shang around 1046 BCE, and subsequently used to explain every dynastic transition in Chinese history down to the fall of the Qing in 1912, where Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant describe named individual gods intervening directly and personally in human affairs. Early Chinese religious thought describes heaven as a more diffuse, administratively organized authority, and later Taoist religious cosmology elaborated this administrative quality into an enormous celestial bureaucracy, presided over by the Jade Emperor and staffed by countless ranked officials, each responsible for a specific department of the natural and human world, a structure scholars widely recognize as directly modeled on the earthly imperial civil service, projecting China's own sophisticated bureaucratic governance onto the heavens themselves. The culture bringer role occupied by Oannes, Thoth, Prometheus, and Quetzalcoatl in the traditions already examined is filled in Chinese tradition by a cluster of legendary sage emperors, most prominently Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, traditionally dated to the 3rd millennium BCE and credited with the invention of writing, the calendar, medicine, the compass, and organized government itself, and Shennong, the divine farmer, credited with inventing agriculture and identifying the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants by personally testing them. Chinese tradition places the Yellow Emperor's activities in explicit connection with Kunlun, a cosmic mountain understood as the earthly residence of the gods and the axis connecting heaven and earth, a sacred mountain motif directly comparable to Mount Hermon in the Enochic tradition, Mount Olympus in Greece, and Mount Meru in Hindu cosmology, reinforcing yet again a nearly universal ancient association between elevated, remote geography and direct divine presence. The Yellow Emperor's decisive victory over the rebellious bronze-working, fog-summoning warlord Qi Yu in a legendary battle credited with securing Huangdi's authority over the Chinese heartland, provides a further instance of the recurring divine conflict pattern this script has traced from the Titanomachy through the Deva-Asura wars. Though Chinese tradition frames this conflict in explicitly historical and dynastic terms, rather than the purely cosmological register of the Greek and Indian material, ancient astronaut researchers point to recurring Chinese motifs of dragons, frequently depicted controlling weather, water, and cosmic order, and to the Yellow Emperor's own legendary ascent into the sky riding a dragon at the end of his reign, as further instances of the sky departure motif already traced repeatedly through this script, though, as throughout, mainstream sinologists read these episodes as symbolic articulations of legitimate imperial authority rather than literal historical memory. The global flood and the genetic reset narrative. Having now encountered flood narratives independently in Mesopotamia, the Bible, India, Greece, and across Mesoamerica and the Andes, this script pauses to examine the pattern as a whole because its consistency across every civilization surveyed is among the strongest cross-cultural convergences this investigation has documented. The Sumerian Ziusudra, the Akkadian Atrahasis, and Utnapishtim, the Hebrew Noah, the Greek Deucalion, warned by his father Prometheus, and surviving with his wife Pyrrha in a chest that comes to rest on Mount Parnassus, the Hindu Manu, warned by a fish avatar of Vishnu and towing his vessel to a mountaintop, and the Mesoamerican and Andean flood traditions already examined, share a remarkably consistent structural skeleton. A senior divine authority, frustrated with humanity, resolves on near-total destruction by water. A single sympathetic figure receives advance warning, often through deception or technical circumvention of a divine prohibition against direct disclosure. A vessel is built to specific dimensions to preserve human and animal life. The flood recedes, and the vessel comes to rest on high ground, and the survivors repopulate a renewed Earth. Mainstream geology and archaeology account for this convergence primarily through the well-documented reality of regional flooding as a genuine recurring catastrophe across nearly every river valley civilization examined in this script, combined with the independent human tendency to interpret catastrophic, community-threatening natural disaster through a moral and theological lens. Some researchers, including geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, have proposed a specific historical trigger for the Mesopotamian and Eastern Mediterranean flood traditions in the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, which argues that rising post-glacial sea levels breached the Bosporus around 5600 BCE, flooding a freshwater basin and displacing populations whose memory of the catastrophe may have propagated outward into the Fertile Crescent, a hypothesis that remains actively debated among geologists but offers a naturalistic mechanism for at least the Near Eastern cluster of flood traditions without requiring independent parallel invention or non-human intervention. Ancient astronaut researchers, without disputing that regional flooding genuinely occurred, emphasize instead the specific, repeated detail already highlighted in the Enochic material, that the flood is framed across multiple traditions not merely as a natural catastrophe, but as a deliberate corrective measure targeting a humanity that had become too numerous, too noisy, or, in the Enochic and Hindu giant narratives specifically, too genetically corrupted through unauthorized divine-human union, a framing they argue points toward a deliberate population management action rather than a purely naturalistic disaster remembered and moralized after the fact. The motif of light, halos, auras, and the language of radiance. Returning to the theme introduced in this script's opening section, the association between divinity and literal physical radiance recurs with a consistency across every tradition examined that deserves brief, direct restatement now that the full cross-cultural pattern has been laid out. The Sumerian melem, a term describing a blinding, awe-inducing radiance emanating from gods, temples, and legitimate kings, functions almost identically to the Egyptian concept of divine Aku, luminous spiritual power, and to the Persian kfarena already examined in connection with the Faravahar, a glory or fortune understood as a literal, transferable radiance attaching to rightful rulers. The Watchers of Enoch appear with faces like lightning and garments brighter than snow. Ezekiel's throne vision is saturated with fire, amber, and rainbow brilliance. The Hindu devas are frequently described as self-luminous, requiring no external light source, and Quetzalcoatl's identification with the morning star Venus ties Mesoamerica's central culture-bringer figure directly to the brightest object in the night sky apart from the moon. This consistency, spanning cultures with no plausible mechanism of direct contact, forms the strongest single thread connecting every tradition surveyed in this script. And it is this thread, more than any individual claim about vimanas, wheels, or winged discs, that gives the phrase, "the shining ones," its interpretive weight. Whether one concludes the radiance was symbolic, psychological, or, as this script's central hypothesis proposes, a literal memory of something that visibly shone. Megaliths and impossible engineering, the physical evidence. Beyond the textual record, a small number of physical sites are repeatedly cited as evidence that ancient construction capability exceeded what conventional chronology allows. The Baalbek platform in Lebanon incorporates the Trilithon, 3 limestone blocks each weighing an estimated 800 tons, quarried, moved, and precisely set into a Roman-era temple podium, a feat that remains genuinely debated among engineers regarding the exact logistics involved, though Roman construction records and comparable, smaller-scale Roman megalithic engineering elsewhere provide a documented technological context largely absent from the Egyptian and Andean cases. Puma Punku, near Tiwanaku in Bolivia, features precisely cut andesite blocks with regular repeating geometric cuts that have prompted speculation about machine tooling, though archaeologists point to documented Andean stoneworking techniques using harder hammerstones and abrasives capable of producing comparable precision through sustained, skilled labor. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dated to roughly 9600 BCE and predating both agriculture and pottery in the region by a considerable margin, has genuinely overturned earlier assumptions that monumental architecture required a settled agricultural society to organize it, demonstrating that hunter-gatherer populations were capable of far more coordinated, large-scale construction than previously believed, a finding mainstream archaeology has fully absorbed without requiring any non-human explanation, though it is frequently cited by alternative history researchers as evidence that organized civilization extends further into the past than conventional chronology previously assumed. In each case, this script presents the site, the specific engineering puzzle it poses, and the documented conventional explanation, while noting, as with the Sphinx erosion question examined earlier, that some specific technical questions, particularly the precise logistics of the largest individual blocks, remain genuinely open within mainstream archaeology itself. Convergence, synthesis, modern parallels, and closing thoughts. Laid side by side, the traditions this script has surveyed, Sumerian, Egyptian, Hebrew, Zoroastrian, Vedic, Greek, Mesoamerican, Andean, and Chinese, converge on a remarkably specific cluster of shared elements, named individual divine beings rather than abstract forces. Direct, hands-on creation or genetic modification of humanity from a combination of earthly and divine material, a factional, internally divided pantheon whose disputes shape human history, specific named teacher figures transmitting agriculture, writing, law, and technical knowledge, sometimes with divine sanction and sometimes in direct defiance of it, followed by severe punishment. A repeated anxiety about human access to immortality met with deliberate denial, a catastrophic flood framed as corrective population management rather than indiscriminate disaster, and a persistent, literal association between legitimate divine authority and physical radiance. Whether this convergence reflects a genuine prehistoric encounter with a technologically advanced, non-human intelligence, independently remembered and reinterpreted by dozens of isolated cultures, or reflects deep shared structures of human psychology and social organization working themselves out repeatedly and independently across every inhabited continent, remains at the close of this script exactly as at its opening, a question this material does not settle on its own. What can be said with confidence is that the modern era's own encounters with the unexplained, the wave of reported aerial phenomena beginning in the mid-20th century, described by witnesses in terms of disc-shaped and cylindrical craft, brilliant, hovering lights, and beings sometimes described as tall, luminous, and humanoid, sometimes as small, gray, and large-eyed, have been read by a significant number of researchers as a continuation rather than a beginning of the same underlying phenomenon. This script has traced back through 5,000 years of written testimony. If the beings described as gods, angels, and demigods across every civilization examined in this script were, as the ancient astronaut hypothesis proposes, physically present, technologically capable visitors, then the modern accounts are simply the latest chapter in an old and continuous story, one that changed its vocabulary from divine to extraterrestrial only because the conceptual framework available to describe it changed, not because the underlying phenomenon did. If, as mainstream scholarship broadly maintains, the ancient accounts instead reflect the universal structures of human myth-making, then the modern accounts may represent the same psychological and cultural machinery operating on genuinely novel stimuli, or on no external stimulus at all, dressed now in the vocabulary of science fiction rather than scripture. This script has tried at every step to present both readings fairly, to flag clearly where the evidence is genuinely contested, and where it has been discredited outright, and to let the sheer weight and specificity of the pattern speak for itself. Every culture that left a written or carved record has told some version of the same story, that once, in the deep past, beings came down from the sky, shining, and were mistaken, or were not mistaken, for gods. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.